Toothworms and bloodletting, medieval dental nightmares. In the dim, candlelit chambers of medieval Europe, the very thought of dental pain brought dread that ran deeper than any wound on the battlefield. To have a toothache in those days was to suffer in silence or submit to treatments that bordered on torture. People did not understand bacteria or nerve endings, nor did they have access to sterile tools or anesthesia. Instead, they believed that tiny creatures, so-called toothworms, were the root cause of dental agony. This idea, strange as it may sound today, was widely accepted. Toothworms were thought to burrow into the teeth, gnawing away and causing the unbearable pain associated with cavities and decay. When someone complained of a throbbing tooth, it wasn't inflammation or infection they feared. It was a writhing, invisible invader. The belief in toothworms had a long history, stretching back even to ancient Mesopotamia, but it flourished in the medieval world where scientific understanding had stalled. Without microscopes or germ theory, people leaned on what they could see or imagine. The pain felt like something crawling or drilling, so it must have been worms. Remedies, as one might expect, were based on this flawed logic. One treatment involved placing a heated metal needle into the cavity of the tooth, not to sterilize, but in an attempt to smoke out the worms. This practice left patients howling in pain and often worsened the condition. Others tried herbal fumigations, directing smoke into the mouth from burning henbane or other herbs, hoping to either kill or chase out the worms with foul fumes. But even beyond the myth of the toothworm, medieval dental care was a terrifying experience. Bloodletting was often prescribed for dental pain. It might seem unrelated today, but at the time, medical theory revolved around the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. An excess of one could cause illness, and tooth pain was seen as a sign of too much blood. So, to bring the body back into balance, a barber surgeon might bleed the patient, either by cutting into the veins or using leeches. The idea was to relieve internal pressure, thus easing the pain. In reality, it only left the patient weaker and more vulnerable to infection. If the pain persisted, and it often did, more drastic measures were taken. Extraction was the medieval solution to persistent dental problems. There were no specialized dentists, only barbers or traveling tooth pullers who would offer their services at fairs or markets. These individuals rarely had any formal training, and their tools were basic at best: pliers, iron hooks, or even their bare hands. A tooth could be pulled in the middle of a public square, often as a form of entertainment. Spectators gathered not only to cheer, but to watch the spectacle of someone suffering. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and no aftercare. If the root broke, it was simply left to fester. Infection was common, and many people died not from the toothache itself, but from sepsis that followed these crude extractions. Yet not all medieval attempts at dental care were rooted in blood and horror. Some healers did try to soothe pain with herbal concoctions. Clove oil, still used today for toothaches, was known in some circles and applied directly to the gum. Myrrh, mint, and sage were also used in poultices or mouth rinses. But these gentler remedies were often overshadowed by more aggressive methods. People were desperate, and desperation led to extremes. In cases where teeth had rotted down to the gums, treatments could include lancing the flesh to release supposed evil humors or cauterizing the area with hot irons. What's even more haunting is how superstition wove itself into every layer of medical practice. A sore tooth might be seen as punishment for sin, a physical manifestation of moral decay. Priests sometimes played a role in healing the afflicted, offering prayers or placing relics on the sufferer's cheek in hopes of divine intervention. Holy water was sprinkled over swollen jaws, and charms were worn around the neck to ward off further pain. It wasn't uncommon for someone to visit a chapel after a painful extraction, thanking the saints for surviving the ordeal rather than seeking medical advice. Even basic oral hygiene, by modern standards, was nearly non-existent. People didn't brush their teeth with toothpaste. At best, they might rub their teeth with cloth, use twigs or chalk powder, or rinse with wine or vinegar. These methods offered little protection against decay and often eroded the enamel further. The wealthy might commission rudimentary toothbrushes made from animal bristle, but such tools were rare and seen more as status symbols than practical necessities. Breath freshening was a more prominent concern than cavity prevention. leading to a reliance on spices, aromatic herbs, and mouth perfumes. The smell of rotting teeth and infected gums was something people simply lived with. In the closed quarters of medieval homes and halls, the scent of decay was as common as smoke or sweat. It was part of life, like the church bells or the creaking of carts. Many individuals would live with blackened, broken teeth until they fell out naturally or became too painful to ignore. Children were not spared either. Tooth decay did not discriminate by age, and medieval texts mention the use of opium and alcohol to quiet the cries of young ones racked with dental pain. The few institutions that did concern themselves with health, like monasteries, often relied on ancient texts passed down through generations. Much of their knowledge came from Greek and Roman sources, preserved through the ages but rarely questioned. Galen, Hippocrates, and others were seen as unquestionable authorities, and so the same errors were repeated for centuries. Even when early advances in anatomy and physiology hinted at more accurate causes for disease, they were ignored or dismissed. The dominance of church dogma meant that curiosity could be dangerous, and innovation was often equated with heresy. One of the more bizarre practices involved talismans made from animal parts. Some believed that wearing a badger's tooth on a string would protect their own teeth from pain. Others kept mouse bones in small leather pouches, tucked away beneath clothing. There was a belief that transferring pain to another object or creature could remove it from the body, leading to strange rituals involving dolls, wax figures, or buried offerings. While these may sound absurd today, to the people of the time they represented real hope. When science fails to explain, imagination fills the void. The psychological impact of living in constant fear of dental issues cannot be understated. Imagine growing up knowing that if your tooth begins to hurt, there's no relief, only suffering, bleeding, and possibly death. It's no wonder that many endured pain as long as possible, only seeking help when the agony became overwhelming. This delay often turned simple cavities into dangerous infections. Swollen faces, abscesses, and oozing wounds were commonplace. Some who survived severe infections were left disfigured or with permanent damage to their jawbones. The cultural narratives around teeth also shaped behavior. In some regions, it was believed that tooth pain could be cured by whispering to the moon or chanting specific phrases under the stars. Others consulted folk healers who performed rituals that resembled more performance than treatment. These ceremonies might involve rhythmic drumming, chanting, or symbolic gestures meant to draw the pain out of the body. The line between medicine and magic was blurred, and people turned to whatever gave them comfort. Despite the grim picture, these practices were not born out of cruelty, but ignorance. Medieval society did the best it could with the tools and knowledge it had. In many ways, their willingness to endure such suffering reflects a resilience that is hard to comprehend today. What they lacked in scientific insight, they compensated for with belief, community, and an astonishing threshold for pain. As time passed and medical understanding improved, the myths of toothworms and the reliance on bloodletting faded. The Enlightenment brought skepticism and inquiry, replacing superstition with reason. But the shadows of the past still echo in modern fears of the dentist's chair. That deep primal anxiety about losing control, experiencing pain, or confronting the unknown has roots in a time when a simple toothache could end your life. Looking back, the medieval approach to dental care offers more than just a lesson in bad medicine. It reveals how humans across time have always tried to make sense of suffering. Whether through herbs, steel, or prayers, they sought relief in a world that gave them few options. And though their methods may seem nightmarish to us now, they laid the groundwork for the science we often take for granted today. Medieval deodorants, spoiled fruit, and herbs. In the shadowed corridors of medieval castles and the bustling streets of old towns, where sewage ran freely and baths were rare luxuries, the scent of daily life was far from fragrant. Cleanliness, as we understand it today, did not exist, and in the absence of modern hygiene, people relied on whatever nature or ingenuity could offer to mask the human odor that clung persistently to their bodies. One of the most unusual solutions to this age-old problem was the use of spoiled fruits and aromatic herbs as primitive deodorants. While the idea may sound unappealing by contemporary standards, In its time, it was considered a clever blend of availability, superstition, and rudimentary understanding of natural properties. The concept of personal fragrance in medieval times was deeply intertwined with societal class and environment. The wealthier segments of society, who had more access to imported herbs, dried flowers, and fruit, were more likely to make use of these rudimentary deodorizing methods. Poorer individuals had fewer resources and were left to depend on what little they could grow or forage. Interestingly, spoiled fruit was not regarded with disgust in the same way it is now. Instead, overripe fruit was believed to hold intensified aromas that could overpower or blend with the more offensive body odors. Peaches, apples, and even citrus fruit, though rare, were sometimes mashed and rubbed into the underarms or along the neck. As these fruits fermented, their natural sugars and acids created a pungent yet sweet fragrance that lingered for hours. Herbs played an even more significant role. Rosemary, sage, mint, and lavender were prized not only for their pleasant scents, but for their supposed spiritual and medicinal properties. People believed these plants could ward off disease, particularly through the air, a belief rooted in the miasma theory of disease, which suggested that foul odors carried sickness. By binding sprigs of herbs into small sachets and tucking them into their clothing or under their arms, individuals hoped to both mask bodily smells and protect themselves from illness. These herbal packets, often sewn into linen pouches or tucked into leather belts, were an early form of wearable deodorant, though the goal was more about survival than social etiquette. The preparation of these deodorizing mixtures often involved crushing herbs with mortars and mixing them into vinegars, wines, or even animal fats, depending on the desired consistency and longevity. Vinegar was particularly popular, as it not only helped preserve the organic mixture, but also was believed to have purifying effects. The result was a sort of paste or balm that could be rubbed onto the skin. While the scent of vinegar might seem off-putting now, it was considered sharp and invigorating in its time, especially when infused with lavender or thyme. Spoiled fruits, on the other hand, offered a paradox. As they aged, their fragrance intensified, but so did the potential for attracting flies or worsening the very stench they were supposed to cover. Yet people found creative ways around this. For instance, fruit might be left to ferment just enough to become fragrant without rotting entirely, then mixed with ground petals from flowers such as rose or marigold. This fragrant mash was dabbed onto cloth and worn beneath garments, creating a kind of slow-release perfume. Some wealthier individuals even commissioned servants to regularly refresh these cloth pads throughout the day. In monasteries and religious communities, where cleanliness rituals held symbolic meaning, there was a stronger emphasis on herbal usage. Many monks maintained herb gardens and used their botanical knowledge to craft salves and tinctures meant to purify the body and soul. Mint was chewed and rubbed onto the skin, both for its cleansing sensation and sharp aroma. Juniper berries were crushed and mixed with oils, believed to purify the skin and offer spiritual protection. These practices were less about personal grooming and more about aligning the body with religious purity. Among women, especially in courtly circles, personal scent was both a delicate matter of propriety and subtle flirtation. Women might soak cloths in rose water infused with clove or cinnamon and pat their bodies with it during their morning routines. Though access to such ingredients was limited, trade routes from the East occasionally provided precious spices and oils, allowing the elite to craft more complex fragrances. These concoctions were stored in ornate glass vials or ceramic jars and guarded like treasure. Sometimes a piece of fruit such as an orange or lemon would be hollowed out and filled with a blend of herbs and dried petals, then carried like a scented pomander. Civic and medical authorities occasionally weighed in on these practices, especially during times of plague or mass illness. Physicians recommended the burning of herbs like rosemary and laurel in sick rooms and public spaces, believing the aromatic smoke could cleanse the air. This led some to believe that wearing herbs close to the body offered similar protection. The line between hygiene and health blurred, and people clung to whatever tools they could to shield themselves from disease, like even if it meant coating their bodies in what we might now consider putrefaction. The psychological effect of scent also played a role. In an era when sanitation was sparse and bathing infrequent, familiar aromas became comforting. A sprig of rosemary behind the ear or the tang of fermenting apple under the arm created a personal scent identity, one that friends, lovers, or family members came to recognize and associate with the individual. It was not only about masking odor, but also about self expression and reassurance in a world full of unpredictability. Bathing practices varied wildly across Europe, with some cultures embracing regular steam baths while others regarded full body immersion with suspicion. Where bathing was rare, deodorants made from spoiled fruit and herbs became more critical. They were applied liberally before public gatherings, religious services, or any event where people were confined in close quarters. In marketplaces, the air was often thick with a competing mixture of body smells, animal dung, and herbal perfumes, creating a sensory assault that modern noses would struggle to endure. Children were also introduced early to these customs. Mothers rubbed fragrant herbs onto their babies, not only to mask natural scents, but to protect them from supposed evil spirits or illness. Babies might sleep with small bundles of dried flowers tied to their cradles, a practice that carried into adulthood for some. Over time, these scents became associated with safety, cleanliness, and even maternal affection. Seasonal availability played a role in what ingredients could be used. In spring and summer, fresh herbs and fruits were plentiful, allowing for vibrant and pungent mixtures. In colder months, people relied on dried ingredients or turned to animal-derived products like rendered fat or beeswax to help preserve whatever scent they could capture. The resulting balms were waxy and often stored in wooden or bone containers, which were tucked discreetly into layers of clothing. Despite the lack of formal science behind these practices, medieval people understood through observation and tradition what combinations worked best. They knew, for instance, that basil could suppress sour odors, or that camphor had a cooling, sharp aroma ideal for the warmer months. They experimented constantly, and in doing so, laid the primitive groundwork for what would eventually evolve into perfumery and modern deodorants. Even in romantic contexts, scent played an important role. Lovers exchanged small cloths scented with fruit or herbs, a gesture both intimate and symbolic. These scented tokens might be kept close to the heart or sewn into the lining of a sleeve. In poetry and song, fragrance was often used as a metaphor for virtue, beauty, or hidden passion. The language of scent became woven into the very fabric of medieval culture, tied to both status and sentiment. By the late medieval period, especially in cities, guilds began forming around apothecaries and herbalists. These early professionals started refining the production of deodorant-like substances. Recipes were recorded and passed down, often shrouded in secrecy. Some were shared between families as treasured knowledge, passed from mother to daughter or between trusted servants. As trade expanded, ingredients like myrrh, musk, and sandalwood were incorporated, enriching the palette of available scents and pushing the boundaries of what these natural deodorants could achieve. Yet for all the creativity and effort, these solutions were always a temporary fix. No matter how rich or poor, everyone eventually had to contend with the undeniable human scent. In a world without showers, deodorant sticks, or antiperspirant sprays, it was a daily act of improvisation, a struggle against the inevitable. But in that struggle, medieval people expressed ingenuity, resilience, and a strange kind of elegance. They took what they had, overripe fruit, sprigs of green, vinegar from a dusty jug, and turned it into something that allowed them to face the world with a measure of confidence, however fleeting. Even today, traces of these ancient practices linger. The modern obsession with essential oils, natural remedies, and plant-based cosmetics owes much to these early earthy experiments. Though our methods are more refined, the impulse remains the same: to feel clean, to smell pleasant, and to connect scent with identity. The medieval use of spoiled fruit and herbs may seem bizarre through the lens of modernity, but it speaks to a timeless desire to rise above the grime of life and reach for something just a little more graceful. Removing freckles with vinegar and sandpaper. In an era when cosmetic science was still in its infancy and beauty standards were shaped by superstition and trial and error practices, individuals often turned to the most unusual and uncomfortable methods in the pursuit of clearer, unblemished skin. Among these unconventional remedies, One particularly abrasive method gained a troubling form of popularity, removing freckles with vinegar and sandpaper. This raw combination of acid and abrasion was not a sophisticated procedure rooted in medical understanding, but rather a desperate attempt to conform to ideals that equated flawless skin with status, virtue, and desirability. Freckles, though harmless and often a charming genetic trait, were historically viewed with suspicion or disdain in certain periods. They were sometimes associated with peasantry, sun exposure, or even moral impurity. Those who had them often faced social pressure to eliminate them at any cost. Without access to dermatologists or knowledge about skin biology, many people relied on folk remedies passed down through word of mouth. And one such method promised to erase freckles through a burning mixture of vinegar's acidic properties and the coarse scraping of sandpaper. The belief was that vinegar, particularly distilled white or apple cider vinegar, could lighten the skin due to its acetic acid content. It was thought to have exfoliating properties that could penetrate and bleach the pigmented spots. Sandpaper, or rough cloth when sandpaper wasn't available, was employed to sand away the outer layer of the skin where the freckles resided. This combination, when applied repeatedly, was intended to strip away visible pigmentation and reveal a paler, freckle-free layer beneath. But the actual experience was far from the serene spa-like treatments one might imagine today. The process began by soaking a cloth or cotton in vinegar and dabbing it over the affected areas. This alone would cause stinging, especially if the skin was already sensitive. Then came the harsh part, using fine-grained sandpaper or a rough abrasive surface to rub the skin in small, circular motions. The action was meant to remove the topmost layer of skin, what we now know as the stratum corneum, and encourage new, less pigmented skin to emerge. However, in reality, the skin often reacted with inflammation, redness, and micro-injuries, resulting in scabbing and sometimes permanent scarring. Despite the pain, the practice persisted. This wasn't because it was genuinely effective, but because the minor fading or temporary lightening achieved through skin trauma was mistaken for success. In truth, the damage caused by repeated abrasion could worsen pigmentation over time or lead to hyperpigmentation, the very problem the treatment aimed to resolve. Moreover, this method did not discriminate between freckles and the rest of the skin. It harmed everything it touched. Stories from the time describe women, and some men, who endured this torturous method in the privacy of their homes, covering their raw, sanded faces with cloths while healing. They would often go through several cycles of treatment, believing the sting and soreness were necessary signs that the remedy was working. In many cases, people applied vinegar without moderation, thinking more acid meant faster results. This only exacerbated their skin sensitivity and delayed the healing process, sometimes resulting in infection. Sanitation was rarely part of the procedure, and the tools used were seldom sterilized, increasing the risk of bacterial contamination. What's both tragic and fascinating is how this practice persisted not in spite of the pain, but because of it. There was a belief that true beauty required suffering, that one had to endure pain to achieve purity or social acceptance. The sensation of burning or rawness was interpreted not as a red flag, but as proof of dedication. In some communities, this method was even recommended by elders as a rite of passage into adulthood or a way to prepare for marriage or courtship. As a result, many young individuals underwent these treatments long before their skin was fully developed, further compounding the risks. The cultural perception of freckles shifted from place to place, but where they were seen as flaws, the vinegar and sandpaper ritual found fertile ground. In some historical records, you can find early references to this technique being mentioned in beauty manuals or herbal guides, not as medical advice, but as shared wisdom among those desperate for a smoother complexion. Some texts even recommended mixing vinegar with lemon juice or ground salt for added potency, turning the treatment into a kind of chemical assault on the skin. Curiously, despite the widespread use of this method, very little was done to verify its safety or efficacy. Without microscopes or skin cell analysis, people couldn't see the long-term effects occurring beneath the surface. Scarring, overexposure to the sun due to thinned skin, and even premature aging were common consequences. Those who subjected themselves to repeated sessions often found that their skin became more sensitive to light, more prone to blotchiness, and significantly less resilient. But because knowledge was limited and medical intervention was rare or unaffordable, these outcomes were tolerated as acceptable risks. It wasn't just individuals applying this method to themselves. In certain cases, unlicensed practitioners or self-proclaimed beauty experts would offer treatments using similar tactics. They charge clients to perform these aggressive exfoliations, sometimes even promising complete transformation. These sessions often took place in dimly lit back rooms using rudimentary tools, with no oversight or hygienic safeguards. Clients would emerge with bleeding skin and were told to cover their faces and avoid sunlight for days. When infections occurred, they were treated with herbal salves or ignored entirely, under the assumption that the skin would eventually harden or adapt. Over time, stories began to circulate about individuals who had permanently damaged their skin using this method. Some lost pigmentation in patches, resulting in uneven complexions. Others developed raised scars or chronic sensitivity. In rare but severe cases, the damage triggered more serious dermatological conditions that required lifelong care. Yet even then, the persistence of this method in certain circles underscored how deeply entrenched beauty ideals were and how far people were willing to go to meet them. Eventually, as medical science progressed and dermatology became a recognized field, the practice was widely discredited. Modern understanding of skin pigmentation revealed that freckles originate deeper than surface-level abrasion could safely reach, and that trauma to the skin only increased melanin activity in many individuals. Safe alternatives like chemical peels, laser treatments, and topical agents began to replace these brutal practices. Yet, the memory of such methods remains a stark reminder of how cultural pressure can drive people toward damaging behavior. Looking back, the use of vinegar and sandpaper to remove freckles stands as an eerie testament to the lengths to which people once went to feel beautiful or accepted. It was not born of vanity, but of fear. Fear of rejection, of judgment, of being seen as different or lesser. In trying to erase something as harmless as freckles, people ended up injuring themselves, caught between outdated ideals and a lack of knowledge. The scars left behind were often more lasting than the freckles themselves. While today's skincare industry offers products grounded in research and governed by regulation, the echoes of these past remedies serve as cautionary tales. They remind us to approach new trends with skepticism and to cherish the skin we're in, rather than sanding it away in pursuit of a fleeting ideal. Beauty, after all, should not come at the cost of pain, nor should it be shaped by fear. The freckle, once scrubbed and burned from the skin, now finds admiration in many cultures, a shift that proves just how fickle and constructed our perceptions of beauty truly are. Drinking mercury for a youthful glow. In the annals of history, the pursuit of beauty has often led humanity down strange and dangerous paths. Among the most alarming of these was the belief that drinking mercury could preserve youth and vitality. This silvery liquid, mesmerizing in appearance, was once thought to be not just a substance of scientific curiosity, but a miraculous elixir of life. Long before its toxicity was fully understood, mercury was embraced by ancient alchemists, emperors, and the wealthy elite, all lured by the promise of eternal youth and radiant skin. What began as a mystical fascination gradually evolved into a widespread and deadly beauty practice, one that left countless victims suffering in silence behind painted smiles and smooth faces. In ancient China, mercury held a central role in Taoist alchemical traditions. It was revered as a key component in the elusive formula for immortality. Some emperors, obsessed with transcending death, ordered their court physicians and alchemists to concoct potions rich in mercury, believing these shimmering brews would stave off aging and decay. One of the most infamous cases is that of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China. Determined to achieve eternal life, he consumed mercury-laced elixirs regularly, convinced that each sip was a step closer to godhood. Instead of preserving his life, these toxic brews eroded his body from the inside, contributing to his untimely demise and mental instability. Mercury's association with beauty was not confined to the East. In Renaissance Europe, where pale, flawless skin was considered the ultimate mark of nobility, mercury found its way into cosmetics and so-called rejuvenating tonics. Women of the upper class, desperate to maintain their youthful allure, would drink mixtures laced with mercury or apply mercury-based creams to their faces. These preparations promised to smooth wrinkles, brighten complexion, and give the illusion of eternal youth. The damage, however, was insidious. Over time, mercury poisoning led to trembling hands, loss of coordination, extreme mood swings, and in many cases, slow and painful deaths. But in a world where appearance meant power, the cost was often ignored. The mystique of mercury was reinforced by its very nature. Unlike other elements, it exists as a liquid metal at room temperature, flowing like molten silver. This ethereal quality gave it a mystical reputation, one that alchemists believed held the secrets to transformation, not just of metals into gold, but of aging flesh into youthful beauty. Mercury's reflective surface symbolized clarity and purity, while its fluid form suggested adaptability and renewal. These symbolic associations only deepened the belief that ingesting it could infuse the human body with similar properties. Even as early physicians began to note the harmful effects of mercury, its use continued. The idea that beauty demanded sacrifice was deeply entrenched in many societies. Pain, illness, and risk were considered acceptable prices to pay for maintaining one's youth. In courts and salons, women with trembling limbs and sallow complexions were still admired for their porcelain skin, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the very treatments meant to preserve their beauty were steadily destroying them. Mercury poisoning often manifested as chronic fatigue, severe headaches, and memory loss, symptoms which tragically were frequently dismissed as signs of emotional frailty or melancholy, rather than recognized as evidence of toxicity. Men, too, were not immune to mercury's allure. Wealthy patrons and noblemen, eager to prolong their strength and status, would consume mercury-laced brews prepared by court healers. These concoctions were often mixed with exotic herbs, honey, or wine to mask their metallic bitterness. The belief was that these tonics would invigorate the body, improve virility, and slow the ravages of time. In some societies, these drinks were also considered aphrodisiacs, further reinforcing their desirability. What resulted was a tragic paradox. The very effort to maintain life and beauty hastened decay and death. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of this historical trend is the way it blurred the line between medicine and vanity. Physicians who prescribed mercury-based treatments often did so in good faith, unaware of the element's long-term consequences. In other cases, charlatans preyed on the desperation of aging clients, selling bottled mercury under grand names like Liquid Moonlight or Eternal Silver. Markets thrived on this dangerous trade, with mercury becoming a staple in both apothecaries and beauty parlors. The demand was so great that the harmful side effects were downplayed or ignored entirely. Those who dared to question the safety of these treatments were often dismissed as jealous rivals or ignorant commoners. Despite mounting evidence of mercury's dangers, belief in its rejuvenating properties persisted for centuries. In some cultures, the glowing appearance of the skin after mercury application, though actually a sign of inflammation, was mistaken for a sign of health. Users, noticing the immediate cosmetic effects, were often encouraged to continue use despite growing discomfort. The cycle of dependency deepened, with victims increasing their dosage in pursuit of greater results, not realizing they were poisoning themselves more with each dose. Entire generations of individuals succumbed to mercury's slow destruction, their suffering hidden behind veils, powder, and pride. The tragedy of mercury as a beauty treatment is also a story of trust misplaced in appearances and authority. People believed in the power of mercury not just because of its beauty, but because their leaders, doctors, and cultural icons endorsed it. In many cases, those who consumed mercury were not fools, but victims of the era's limited scientific understanding. They placed their faith in the wisdom of their age and suffered the consequences. Their plight is a haunting reminder of how easily hope and ignorance can intertwine, leading to practices that are both culturally accepted and profoundly harmful. Over time, as medical science advanced and the true effects of mercury were studied, its use in beauty and health practices began to decline. Still, remnants of its influence linger. Even into the 20th century, some skin whitening creams and anti-aging products in various parts of the world were found to contain traces of mercury. Regulatory efforts eventually banned its inclusion in cosmetics, but underground markets and unregulated products continued to circulate, often targeting vulnerable populations desperate for beauty and status. The desire for youth remained, but the lessons of Mercury's history began to reshape the conversation around beauty and safety. Today, the story of drinking mercury for a youthful glow stands as a chilling testament to the extremes of human vanity and the dangers of pseudoscience. It is a reflection of how easily the desire to defy time can lead us to trust the wrong substances and the wrong people. Though we look back with disbelief, modern parallels can still be drawn. New miracle treatments emerge every year and promising to reverse aging or transform appearance with little evidence to back their claims. The faces may be different, the bottles more refined, but the core desire and the risks remain hauntingly familiar. In remembering the men and women who sought immortality in the silvery poison, we are reminded of the fragility of beauty and the cost of blind trust. Their stories are not just relics of the past, but warnings etched in history. They drank mercury in hopes of eternal light, but instead found only darkness. Through their suffering, a painful truth emerged. Real beauty cannot be bottled and youth cannot be swallowed. Even with the benefit of hindsight, the tale of mercury's use as a beauty tonic continues to captivate modern imaginations, not because of its elegance, but because of the haunting paradox it represents, how something so visually alluring could be so devastating within. It serves as a stark emblem of how the desire to conquer time can twist even the brightest minds into embracing poison disguised as salvation. In dusty old journals and faded letters, echoes of those who suffered in silence still linger, recounting tales of trembling limbs and failing vision, of once vibrant individuals whose vitality was stolen by the very liquid they believed would restore it. The legacy of this practice isn't merely a historical curiosity, it's a mirror. It challenges today's world to scrutinize the latest trends promising transformation without consequence. Whether it's an untested injection, a radical procedure, or a mysterious supplement, the ghost of mercury hovers nearby, whispering warnings we dare not forget. In their desperate pursuit of youth, people of the past offered a cautionary tale soaked in silver. What remains is not just a story of beauty, but of human vulnerability, our willingness to risk everything for the illusion of eternity. And that perhaps is the most tragic glow of all. The dangerous allure of belladonna-eyed women. In dimly lit chambers lined with velvet drapes and mirrored vanity tables, a strange beauty trend once flourished, a trend that enticed with mystery and ended with danger. The women who followed it became known for their haunting gaze, pupils dilated like midnight moons, eyes glistening with an unnatural luster. Behind this almost hypnotic beauty was belladonna, a poisonous plant whose very name, meaning beautiful woman in Italian, offered a cruel irony. The practice of using extracts of this deadly nightshade to enlarge the pupils was both a mark of elite sophistication and a dance with death. Belladonna, in its seductive appeal, became not only a cosmetic, but a symbol of how far people would go for the sake of charm and social power. Belladonna's effects on the human eye were startling. When applied in small doses, usually as eye drops, the alkaloid atropine would temporarily paralyze the muscles in the iris, causing the pupils to dilate dramatically. In candlelit settings, these wide eyes reflected a seductive vulnerability, one that art, literature, and fashion all embraced. Women became living portraits, admired and desired for their almost otherworldly appearance. Yet this illusion came at a price. Repeated exposure to belladonna could cause blurred vision, light sensitivity, headaches, and over time, irreversible damage to the eyes. But in many cases, that long-term harm was overshadowed by the more immediate benefits of being seen as desirable, fashionable, and alluring. It wasn't just about physical beauty, it was about the message those eyes sent. Dilated pupils are often read unconsciously as signs of interest or arousal. In using belladonna, these women were, intentionally or not, weaponizing biology itself, sending silent signals that invited attention. Their gaze seemed perpetually locked in a state of fascination, as if every man in the room held their interest. This illusion gave them power in social spaces where appearances shaped opportunity, alliances, and influence. In a time when women's voices were often muted in public, their eyes could still speak volumes. The origins of belladonna's use in cosmetics can be traced back to the Renaissance, particularly in Italy, where noble women would squeeze the juice of the plant into their eyes to achieve the desired effect. At that time, medical knowledge was limited, and the toxic nature of the plant wasn't fully understood. Herbalists and apothecaries played dual roles as healers and beauty providers, prescribing potions that balanced delicately between medicinal and cosmetic use. Belladonna's transformation from a tool of witches and herbalists to an elite beauty product marked a peculiar shift in cultural values, a moment where elegance intertwined with danger. The plant itself has always inspired both fascination and fear. With dark berries and bell-shaped purple flowers, it hides its danger behind a veneer of botanical beauty. The same hands that crushed its leaves for cosmetics might also have brewed them for more sinister purposes. Its history is intertwined with poisonings, witchcraft, and forbidden love. In the wrong dose, belladonna could halt the heart or plunge a person into delirium. And yet, women looked into their mirrors, counted their drops, and dared fate for the promise of admiration. Some artists of the time immortalized this trend in paint. The gaze of belladonna-eyed women appears in portraits with an unplaceable tension, feminine, mysterious, and strangely detached. The eyes, glassy and vast, became a visual shorthand for aristocratic elegance. Over time, this aesthetic extended into poetry, with writers likening such eyes to deep wells of emotion or dark stars impossible to look away from. But these romanticized depictions often omitted the pain, the discomfort, and the lingering effects experienced by the women themselves. Beneath the surface, vision might blur, colors might distort, and searing headaches could become a daily torment. Those who used belladonna were not all naive. Some were acutely aware of the risk, but they accepted it as a necessary cost in the pursuit of beauty. In some ways, this choice mirrored the wider societal pressure placed on women to sacrifice comfort, health, or autonomy for the sake of appearance. Corsets, bruised ribs, lead paints, poisoned skin, and belladonna stole sight, all in service of a fleeting ideal. Beauty, in this context, was not a gift but a trial, a series of painful rituals meant to elevate, seduce, or maintain status. The allure of the belladonna-eyed woman also created an archetype, a character that lived in stories and salons alike. She was often mysterious, aloof, and distant, yet irresistible. She represented danger cloaked in silk, a person whose beauty seemed to come from another realm. This archetype inspired fascination and sometimes fear in the hearts of those who beheld her. Men admired her, envied her, and sometimes distrusted her. Her eyes became symbols not just of beauty, but of control, proof that even within a society built on male dominance, a woman could still wield a certain power, if only through the way she was seen. But time would reveal the cost. As more women reported failing vision, physicians began to suspect the long-term consequences of belladonna use. Some experienced blindness or severe photophobia, their pupils permanently unresponsive to light. The aesthetic they had pursued left them in darkness, trading momentary admiration for a lifetime of damage. For many, the consequences were not merely physical. To lose one's sight in a world that so valued appearances was a cruel irony. Once the center of attention, they now faded quietly into shadows, their beauty remembered, but no longer seen. Despite these risks, the idea of chemically enhancing beauty didn't vanish. In fact, it evolved. Belladonna may have fallen out of favor as medical understanding grew, but the core impulse it represented, sacrificing health for appearance, persisted through generations. From mercury-laced creams to modern injections, the same dance continues in new forms. The story of belladonna-eyed women is not an isolated tale, but a chapter in a longer book about beauty's darker side, where admiration often walks hand in hand with pain. In some cases, the legacy of belladonna resurfaced in less visible ways. Atropine, its key compound, would go on to find use in modern medicine, particularly in ophthalmology. Ironically, what once blinded women in pursuit of beauty became a tool to save sight in certain medical treatments. But while its role was redefined in science, its cultural symbolism remained rooted in allure and danger. The belladonna-eyed woman lingers in collective memory, a ghost with luminous eyes and a cautionary story written in shadow. In retrospect, this fascination reveals more about society than it does about the plant. It speaks to the value placed on aesthetic perfection, the pressure to conform to ever-changing ideals, and the lengths individuals will go to be seen, desired, and admired. Belladonna's role in this dynamic was potent precisely because it delivered immediate results. There was no need to wait for beauty to bloom. It arrived in a single drop, swift and unrelenting. That immediacy, however, made the consequences all the more brutal. What came quickly also faded quickly, often leaving scars behind. Even as the fashion passed, the myth endured. Literature and film later adopted the concept of the dangerous beauty, often represented with wide, hypnotic eyes. These characters drew from the real history of belladonna use, even if the context was lost. The haunting gaze became shorthand for manipulation, seduction, or unknowable mystery. Rarely did these portrayals explore the suffering behind the eyes. They were icons, not individuals, painted over with layers of fiction, detached from the very real women who once sat with vials and mirrors, trying to perfect a look that could ruin them. To truly understand the story of belladonna in beauty is to confront a paradox. It was a tool that empowered and punished, that gave confidence and took health, that lifted status while dimming sight. The women who used it were not merely victims or fools. They were navigating a complex world that demanded perfection, even at personal cost. Their choices, though dangerous, were also deeply human. A response to the pressures of their time, shaped by fear, hope, and the desire to be seen in the best possible light. And in the end, perhaps that is the most tragic part. The eyes that once shone brightest became the first to fade. The very symbol of allure turned against those who embraced it. Belladonna did not discriminate. It granted its eerie glow and demanded payment in kind. Today, we look back with a mix of fascination and sorrow, drawn to the haunting legacy of a trend that promised beauty and delivered blindness. The memory of the belladonna-eyed woman remains suspended between admiration and warning, a flicker of elegance at the edge of danger. Soot, ash, and charcoal, eyeliner of the damned. In the haunting glow of candlelight and flickering fire, beauty once came with a touch of darkness, both literal and symbolic. Across ancient civilizations and into the winding alleys of history, soot, ash, and charcoal were far more than the remains of burned wood and smoke-stained hearths. These blackened remnants were transformed into tools of allure, power, and mysticism. To paint one's eyes in these substances wasn't merely cosmetic. It was a ritual, a declaration, sometimes a disguise, and at other times a shield. In a world where reflection came from polished metals instead of mirrors, and where superstition often guided science, these primitive materials served purposes far beyond aesthetics. The ancient Egyptians are perhaps the most iconic in their use of black coal, derived in part from burned substances like soot and crushed minerals. This dark line that traced their lower lids was not only decorative, but also practical, protecting eyes from the relentless desert sun and the infectious pests that came with it. Yet even earlier, in tribal societies scattered across deserts and jungles, ash and charcoal were ground finely and applied to the face not for glamour, but to intimidate, to mourn, or to signal readiness for war. The darkness that rimmed the eyes seemed to draw from some other realm, giving the wearer an air of mystery, strength, or sorrow, depending on the intent. In many early cultures, soot and ash carried spiritual meanings, often associated with transition, death, or purification. They were symbols of what had been destroyed, yet paradoxically, what remained. Applying them around the eyes was like peering through the veil between the known and the unknown. The charcoal, painstakingly prepared from burnt wood or bone, was sometimes mixed with animal fat or resin to give it texture and sticking power. This created a smudge-proof darkness that clung to skin with a ghostly persistence, even under sweat or tears. It didn't wash away easily, and perhaps that permanence added to its appeal. Roman women, especially in the empire's decadent twilight, often used soot and powdered ashes in their beauty regimens. The materials were not only affordable but symbolically powerful. These women understood that beauty could be sharpened by contrast. Pale skin set against deep black lines made the eyes appear larger, more defined, even predatory. In a world of intrigue and silent observations, the eyes became weapons. And what better to forge these weapons than the remains of flame and fury? Across medieval Europe, where bathing was rare and cosmetics were often seen as suspicious or sinful, women still sought ways to darken their lashes and lids. Chimney soot was gathered discreetly, ground fine, and stored in little pots or wrapped in cloth. It wasn't openly discussed, especially in deeply religious households, but the practice lingered in whispers, passed between generations. The application was quick. A fingertip dipped and smeared gently across the lid, a crude brush perhaps formed from animal hair, and the transformation began. There was something almost defiant about it, a quiet rebellion against the dulling uniformity of daily life. In regions where fire rituals played central roles, India, Africa, Polynesia, charcoal and ash bore ceremonial weight. The use of these substances around the eyes was an act of calling down ancestral spirits or warding off curses. Shamans and warriors painted their faces with dark streaks that began with sacred fire and ended in silent battle. Here, soot was not vanity, it was protection, invocation, or declaration. The flames that birthed it had consumed offerings, bodies, or relics. What remained was sacred, and the blackness around the eye was a mark of connection to powers beyond human comprehension. In feudal Japan, the theatrical world of kabuki embraced exaggerated eye makeup drawn from burnt sticks of charcoal. The actors, male and female alike, enhanced their expressions through thick, dark lines that created emotion, depth, and drama visible even in the dimmest theater. Charcoal here served as both medium and message, a tool for transformation. Every stroke of darkness carved a new identity, masking the everyday self and birthing a character from ash. Even in pre-Columbian civilizations like the Aztecs and Mayans, the eye was a portal, and darkened rims gave it more gravity. Ashes from ritual sacrifices were sometimes incorporated into facial markings, combining sacred purpose with an aesthetic tradition. The living carried the soot of the dead, and in doing so wore both honor and burden. It was not makeup in the modern sense, it was layered meaning, pressed onto skin with solemn hands. During the Victorian era, where modesty and repression danced with hidden desires, the use of soot and ash in personal beauty routines took a secretive turn. Women, especially those in the theater or the fringes of polite society, mixed lampblack with oils to create a crude eyeliner. This blend, though often irritating to the skin, produced a rich, velvety line that dramatized the eyes under dim gaslight. It was whispered about, condemned by moralists, yet it persisted. Behind closed doors, mirrors reflected not innocence but desire, framed by darkness drawn from flame. As the 20th century dawned, the fascination with bold, dark eyes grew. The flappers of the 1920s embraced coal and soot-based liners, liberated from previous taboos. Though commercial products became more refined, many still turned to traditional methods, burning a candle under a spoon and gathering the residue to apply before an evening out. There was something raw and irresistible about that black, imperfect, handmade, a little dangerous. The idea of the damned in association with soot and ash eyeliner doesn't stem from religious doctrine alone. It speaks to a deeper fear, the fear of transformation, of leaving behind the natural in favor of the constructed, the beautiful, or the cursed. Those who painted their eyes with the dark remains of fire were often seen as otherworldly, seductive, or manipulative. The femme fatale archetype, emerging in literature and early cinema, often wore the heavy eyeshadow of soot and charcoal, her gaze a trap, her beauty a warning. In urban legends and folk tales from Eastern Europe, women who wore dark eye paint were sometimes accused of being witches or forest spirits in disguise. It was said their makeup never smudged, no matter how many tears they shed, and that their eyes could see into the souls of men. The black around their eyes was said to be not just pigment, but a remnant of some other realm. Perhaps they had looked into the void and come back changed. Even as modern eyeliner evolved into sleek pencils and liquid pens, the spirit of those original materials lingers. The symbolism of soot, ash, and charcoal remains potent. Mystery, defiance, and power. The smoky eye of today carries echoes of ritual, survival, seduction, and mourning. Though now worn for fashion or performance, it traces a line back through centuries of human behavior, emotion, and transformation. It is less about product and more about presence, the assertion of the self through an ancient practice of altering appearance using the language of fire. What makes soot and ash so enduring as materials for beauty is not simply their availability, but their origin. Born from combustion, they are what's left after destruction, after heat and pressure and change. To wear them is to wear the evidence of something burned away. There's a quiet poetry in using what was once consumed to highlight the windows of the soul. It is both a tribute and a reclamation. Throughout history, these blackened substances have circled the eyes of the curious, the bold, the sacred, and the defiant. From the pharaoh's courts to the smoky stages of jazz-era clubs, from tribal firesides to silent film screens, soot and charcoal have drawn lines that speak louder than words. They say, "See me as I choose to be seen." They declare intention, emotion, sometimes threat, sometimes invitation. And even today, behind the shimmer of modern pigments and synthetic formulations, that legacy smolders on. Boiled animal fats as skincare lotions. Before the age of modern cosmetic chemistry and synthetically formulated moisturizers, skincare relied on what nature provided, often in its rawest form. Among the most enduring practices throughout early civilizations was the use of boiled animal fats as a base for skincare lotions. These natural oils were derived from animals that played central roles in both the sustenance and the survival of communities. When the meat was consumed and bones used for tools, the fat was not discarded. It was rendered with intention and applied with care, transforming what might have been waste into a valuable emollient for human skin. In harsh climates, where cold winds chapped the skin and dry air drew out natural moisture, people turned to animal fats as a shield against the elements. Hunters, farmers, and even the aristocracy of various cultures knew that these thick, greasy substances could soften cracked hands, restore a weathered face, and provide a barrier against snow, dust, and sun. From the frozen tundras of the north to the arid stretches of desert, the universality of fat-based skincare speaks volumes about its effectiveness and the ingenuity of early people who observed nature and learned from their environment. The process of rendering fat into a usable lotion-like substance began with boiling. Large chunks of suet or tallow were slowly heated over a fire until the pure oil separated from the tissue. This was then strained and cooled into a soft, spreadable balm. The simplicity of the process made it accessible, while the results made it invaluable. This oil, once cooled, became the base for many other additions, including crushed herbs, fragrant resins, or plant extracts, each chosen for its own perceived benefits. Despite the lack of microscopes or molecular analysis, ancient users understood which plants soothed the skin, which ones prevented infection, and how combining them with fat would allow better absorption. Animal fat was prized not only for its protective qualities, but also for its versatility. It was easy to mix, melted quickly upon contact with warm skin, and adhered well to even the roughest surfaces. This made it ideal not only for facial care, but for treating dry elbows, cracked heels, and irritated joints. For laborers whose skin was routinely exposed to physical stress and environmental damage, these fat-based preparations provided relief when nothing else could. The natural composition of these oils mimicked the body's own sebum, allowing them to penetrate deeper and work more effectively than water-based concoctions. Cultural practices surrounding the use of animal fats in skincare were diverse and nuanced. In some communities, certain fats were reserved for ceremonial use or for the upper classes. Whale blubber, for example, was a rare commodity in inland societies and often traded over long distances. In contrast, lard from pigs or tallow from sheep and cows was more common and widely used across many strata of society. Even the preparation method could hold spiritual or social significance, with some groups believing that the act of rendering fat was sacred or best performed under certain conditions or by specific individuals. While the modern mind may recoil at the idea of spreading animal fat onto the skin, it's important to view this practice through the lens of necessity and resourcefulness. To early humans, nothing was wasted. The idea of extracting every ounce of use from an animal, whether for food, shelter, or personal care, was embedded in the rhythm of life. Skincare was not about vanity, but preservation. A face left unprotected in the wind could crack and bleed. Hands too dry to grip tools became a threat to survival. Animal fats answered these needs with quiet efficacy. The texture and aroma of boiled animal fats were often seen as a benefit rather than a drawback. While not perfumed in the way modern lotions are, these fats were often combined with natural aromatics like lavender, chamomile, pine resin, or crushed petals to give a more pleasant experience. Over time, these preparations were refined, with some communities learning how to filter the fats further to reduce odor or change consistency. The addition of beeswax, for example, created a firmer balm. Sandalwood or frankincense infused the mixture with calming scents and subtle healing properties. This rudimentary cosmetic science laid the groundwork for many of the skincare traditions that followed. In ancient Egypt, for instance, animal fats were mixed with myrrh or almond oil and used to soften skin exposed to the desert heat. Roman soldiers applied fat-based ointments after battle to soothe bruises and abrasions. Even during medieval times, herbalists and healers turned to rendered fats as vehicles for delivering their botanical remedies. The idea of using a fatty base to carry medicinal properties became foundational in both folk healing and early pharmacy. Throughout the centuries, there was also a belief that certain animals yielded more potent skincare fats than others. Deer fat was prized for its smooth finish. Bear grease was often used for its rumored regenerative qualities. Goose fat, with its lightweight texture, was preferred for facial applications. These preferences shaped regional trade and seasonal harvesting practices. In colder regions, hunting seasons coincided with the rendering of fats, while in warmer areas, preservation methods like salting or storing in ceramic jars extended the lifespan of these valuable skincare ingredients. As societies advanced, the knowledge surrounding animal fat lotions passed from generation to generation, often through oral tradition. Mothers taught daughters how to render, infuse, and apply. Elders shared tips on treating skin ailments using variations of the same base material. In some places, these formulations were even gifted during marriage or coming-of-age ceremonies, emphasizing their importance in daily life. Fat-based balms were not simply utilitarian, they held symbolic meaning, a reminder of care, continuity, and the bonds of community. During times of scarcity, such as wars or famines, the reliance on boiled fats only intensified. When luxury imports like almond oil or exotic creams were unavailable, people turned back to the basics. Fat from the family's own livestock became a lifeline. Boiled over a humble hearth and ladled into small pots, it became both remedy and reassurance. Even in urban centers, those who couldn't afford apothecary goods made their own salves with scraps of animal trimmings purchased cheaply from butchers. With the arrival of the industrial age and the commercialization of cosmetics, animal fats began to fade from the skincare spotlight. Petroleum-based products, synthetic creams, and imported oils became more fashionable. Yet, even as mainstream culture moved on, pockets of traditional practice remained. In rural areas and among those seeking natural remedies, the old methods persisted. In modern times, there has even been a renewed interest in traditional skincare, with artisanal brands revisiting the use of tallow and lard for their natural properties, often sourced ethically and prepared with updated hygienic standards. What might seem outdated today was once considered an essential part of daily health. In truth, animal fats contain essential vitamins like A, D, E, and K, which are known to support skin regeneration and elasticity. The molecular structure of these fats allows for absorption without clogging pores, something early users may have noticed long before the science confirmed it. These fats also possess anti-inflammatory qualities, making them suitable for skin conditions like eczema or psoriasis, even if those names weren't used back then. The stigma surrounding the use of animal products in cosmetics is largely modern and often disconnected from historical context. For millennia, people simply worked with what they had and what they had proved effective. Skincare wasn't about marketing, it was about resilience. It was about protection against the harsh realities of weather, age, and labor. To apply a fat-based balm was not just an act of care, but one of wisdom, born of lived experience and passed on through the quiet moments of tending to oneself or to another. In traditional households where old methods survive, the preparation of these balms is a communal ritual. Stories are told as the fat simmers, herbs are added with deliberation, and the final product is divided into small containers to be shared or gifted. The practice holds a kind of ancestral memory, an echo of generations who lived close to the land, whose skincare was bound not to brands but to seasons, to soil, and to the animals they raised or hunted. Some might find the concept of using animal fat unsettling, but to those who knew its value, it was a treasure. It offered healing without additives, moisture without preservatives, and longevity without labels. It was humble yet powerful. It was shaped not in a lab, but by fire, by patience, and by a long history of necessity turned into knowledge. Boiled animal fats as skincare lotions are a window into a world where nature was the pharmacy and self-care began not in a spa, but by the hearth with a pot, a ladle, and a little bit of warmth. While innovation continues to drive skincare today, revisiting such ancient traditions reminds us that effective solutions don't always require advanced technology. Sometimes what worked centuries ago still holds its place in the tapestry of human wisdom. And though these balms may no longer be found on the shelves of mainstream stores, their story lives on in farmers' markets, in homesteading communities, and in the careful hands of those reviving ancestral practices with renewed respect. There is something deeply grounding about knowing that even in a world obsessed with fast beauty and chemical formulas, a bit of boiled fat can still soothe, still nourish, and still connect us to the long line of caretakers who came before. In isolated mountain communities, where resources were scarce and winters were brutal, people often depended entirely on the fat they rendered during the autumn hunts. These were not luxuries, but necessities. Without proper protection, frostbite could easily disfigure exposed skin. The boiled fat, still warm and aromatic, was applied generously to cheeks, lips, and foreheads. In some places, it was mixed with ash or ground bark, not only to add medicinal benefit, but also to thicken the mixture for longer-lasting effects. These were the cold weather equivalents of today's high-end moisturizers, though they came without fancy packaging or glossy advertisements. Fats were more than just barriers against physical discomfort. They were also viewed as tools to preserve beauty. Young women in pre-industrial societies would often learn recipes passed down by elder relatives, each one offering a variation believed to preserve smoothness, clarity, or a youthful glow. Some mixtures included powdered pearl, fine clays, or crushed flower petals. These additions weren't just for appearance, they were believed to have energetic or spiritual properties, believed to ward off bad luck or attract good health. Skincare and superstition often walked hand in hand, especially in cultures where the natural world was considered alive with meaning. The effectiveness of fat as a delivery system for healing herbs also contributed to its enduring appeal. In the absence of refrigeration or stabilizers, fat offered a natural way to preserve plant materials and allow their medicinal properties to remain active longer. Calendula, marigold, and yarrow were common infusions, particularly for those treating wounds or chronic dryness. The boiling process helped blend these elements into a unified salve, which was poured into clay vessels or animal horn containers to cool and solidify. These were stored in shadowed corners of kitchens or kept in woven baskets beside beds, ready to be used after a long day's work or a sudden rash. The practice wasn't limited to skin alone. Fat was often used in treating the scalp and hair. Melted and massaged into the roots, it was said to strengthen follicles, reduce flaking, and add shine. In desert regions, camel or goat fat was particularly prized for this purpose. These oils were thick enough to trap moisture even in scorching heat, acting as a natural conditioner and heat barrier. And the shine that resulted was seen not just as a sign of health, but of diligence and self-respect. Maintaining one's appearance using fat-based treatments wasn't vanity. It was a demonstration of discipline and care in an unpredictable world. Children were often the first to benefit from these treatments. Newborns in colder climates were sometimes anointed with fat to protect their sensitive skin from cracking or infection. In some regions, this ritual held symbolic meaning, an act of bonding between mother and child, or a gesture believed to bless the infant with resilience. Over time, this practice extended into early childhood, with parents routinely applying the softened balm to knees, elbows, and noses rubbed raw from play. It became part of the rhythm of family life, alongside feeding, storytelling, and preparing the hearth for the night. What stands out most about this traditional approach is the intimacy of the process. From rendering to application, each step was performed with intention. The smell of simmering fat, the careful straining of liquid through cloth, the addition of flowers or roots crushed by hand, all of it required time, attention, and presence. There was no shortcut, no synthetic replacement. The resulting balm, though simple in appearance, carried the essence of patience, effort, and generational knowledge. When a pot of salve was passed from one set of hands to another, it wasn't just skincare, it was the passing down of comfort, of protection, and of continuity. The fat itself varied depending on the animal and the method of boiling. Suet, taken from around the kidneys of cattle or sheep, produced a smooth, clean tallow with a neutral scent. Lard from pigs offered a softer texture, easier to spread and more readily absorbed. Even bird fat, such as that from ducks or geese, had its place, favored by some for its lighter consistency. Each type had its own properties and best uses. Experienced makers would blend fats together, adjusting ratios based on climate, season, and personal preference, not unlike modern formulators who combine oils for specific skin types. Although many of these methods were grounded in observation rather than scientific explanation, they often arrived at surprisingly effective solutions. Without ever analyzing a molecule, people learned through trial and error which combinations healed wounds fastest, which ones kept the skin from cracking during winter hunts, and which offered relief from sunburn after long days in the fields. This accumulated wisdom wasn't written down in textbooks. It was learned by doing, by watching, and by listening to those who came before. The result was an organic tradition, fluid and adaptive, shaped by environment and necessity rather than commercial desire. As empires expanded and cultures mingled through trade, conquest, and migration, the recipes for these fat-based lotions evolved. Ingredients from one region merged with techniques from another. Spices from the east, like turmeric, saffron, or cardamom, began to appear in salves crafted in the Mediterranean. Nordic peoples infused pine needles, juniper, and lichens into their mixtures, reflecting the forests that surrounded them. African communities blended animal fat with crushed nuts, red earth, or shea from the surrounding landscape, creating richly pigmented balms that soothed and protected in equal measure. In times of ritual, animal fat preparations took on ceremonial meaning. Warriors might apply specific blends before battle, as both protection and blessing. Shamans used infused fats in healing rites, massaging them into the limbs of the sick or the grieving. Brides were sometimes gifted with scented salves to anoint themselves before marriage ceremonies. Each occasion shaped the way the lotion was prepared and applied. In this way, skincare became more than a matter of health. It became a language of gesture, of cultural identity, of seasonal rhythm, and spiritual belief. In today's world, there is a growing movement of people returning to ancestral methods. Frustrated by synthetic ingredients or driven by environmental concerns, some have turned back to the old recipes, rediscovering what was once discarded or forgotten. Modern homesteaders render their own tallow, carefully filter it, and blend it with wild harvested herbs. Artisanal creators sell jars of fat-based lotion at farmers markets, often touting their connection to lost wisdom. And in skincare forums across the internet, discussions about the benefits of tallow and lard have reemerged, not as novelties, but as time-tested remedies that never truly lost their worth. Those who embrace these methods today often speak of their gentleness. Unlike the stinging sensation of alcohol-laden commercial products, these balms glide smoothly over the skin, calming instead of irritating. They report fewer breakouts, reduced inflammation, and a noticeable improvement in skin texture. There's something comforting, they say, in knowing exactly what goes into a product and being able to pronounce every ingredient. Fat, it turns out, offers more than just moisture. It offers simplicity, transparency, and a reconnection with nature. In the grand timeline of skincare, boiled animal fats were among the first, and perhaps among the most enduring. They tell a story of survival, adaptation, and resourcefulness. Their legacy isn't only in how they softened skin, but in how they nurtured families, reflected culture, and preserved knowledge. Whether used by a shepherd watching over flocks beneath the stars, or a healer tending wounds in a candlelit hut, the humble jar of rendered fat held a place of honor on every shelf and in every life it touched. Arsenic complexions, pale but poisoned. In an era when fashion dictated not just what one wore but how one looked, the pursuit of a pale complexion became more than just a trend, it became an obsession. Pale skin signified refinement, class, and a life untouched by the sun-drenched labor of peasants. It was a badge of aristocracy, of delicacy, and of perceived moral superiority. And in the relentless chase to maintain or mimic this appearance, many turned to the most dangerous of allies, arsenic. Known today as a potent poison, arsenic was once tucked neatly into beauty regimens, often hidden in powders, lotions, and tonics that promised porcelain skin. The irony of poisoning oneself in the name of beauty was not lost on history, yet it continued, driven by vanity, ignorance, and societal pressure. Women and men alike sought the ghostly glow that arsenic could provide. It didn't merely lighten the skin, it made it unnaturally flawless, masking blemishes, freckles, and the flush of life with a chalky perfection. Those who used arsenic-based cosmetics would often develop a translucent pallor, their veins sometimes becoming more visible beneath their skin, lending them an ethereal, almost otherworldly appearance. This look was not just desired, it was admired. The frailty it suggested was seen as alluring, a visual whisper of delicacy and gentleness, even as it silently undermined the health of those who wore it. The appeal of arsenic lay not only in its ability to alter appearance, but in how it was marketed. Vendors promised eternal youth, blemish-free faces, and a radiant glow that would outshine even nature's best efforts. Arsenic wafers, for instance, were sold as dietary supplements, instructing women to consume them regularly to improve their skin. These tiny pills were often glamorized in advertisements that showed serene women with flawless faces, their serene expressions hiding the devastating effects lurking beneath the surface. As users ingested arsenic or applied it to their faces, subtle changes began to take hold. The skin would indeed appear smoother and lighter, but it came at a cost. Nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and neurological symptoms were early indicators of arsenic's toll. Over time, chronic exposure could cause hair loss, tooth decay, and severe internal damage. Yet the changes crept in gradually, camouflaged beneath the veneer of beauty. By the time signs of poisoning became undeniable, many had already developed a dependence on the very substance that was destroying them. Despite medical warnings, arsenic beauty products flourished in the 19th century. Their use was particularly rampant among the upper classes who could afford such luxuries and who most keenly felt the pressure to uphold rigid beauty standards. Even when rumors spread of premature deaths and mysterious illnesses among young women, few connected the dots. Beauty, after all, demanded sacrifice, and for many, the price was worth it. They adorned themselves in silks, jewels, and the invisible touch of poison. Society's relentless glorification of pale skin created a demand that outpaced reason. Sunlight was shunned, parasols and gloves were common, and women layered their skin with arsenic creams without a second thought. It wasn't simply about looking beautiful. It was about fitting into a narrative where paleness equaled purity and desirability. In this narrative, health was secondary and suffering was part of the ritual. Mothers passed the practice down to their daughters, sharing beauty secrets laced with poison. They believed they were helping them succeed in a world that judged women by their looks. A clear, pale face could open doors that intelligence or kindness could not. It could secure a good marriage, command admiration, and offer a sense of control in a society where women had few real powers. Thus, arsenic quietly took root in family traditions, masquerading as wisdom. As the obsession grew, so did the variety of products laced with arsenic. Powders, soaps, facial lotions, even shampoos. Arsenic was everywhere. Its inclusion wasn't always explicitly stated. Instead, it lurked behind vague labels, often disguised under scientific or exotic-sounding names to avoid suspicion. Trusting consumers had no idea they were willingly inviting death into their routines. They followed instructions meticulously, reapplying throughout the day, layering danger upon danger in the name of social acceptance. Artists and writers of the time occasionally captured the tragic beauty of these poisoned appearances. Poems spoke of women with skin like alabaster, untouched by sun or time, their lips pale and eyes shadowed, not by makeup, but by illness. Paintings immortalized these women, unknowingly documenting the effects of slow poisoning. The romanticism of their appearance shielded the truth, wrapping the horrors of chemical exposure in layers of cultural admiration. Over time, cases of arsenic poisoning became harder to ignore. Physicians began documenting patterns, women, often young and otherwise healthy, succumbing to strange illnesses. Their symptoms varied, but the root cause pointed again and again to prolonged arsenic exposure. Medical journals published findings, and a few brave voices called for reform. Still, progress was slow. The beauty industry was lucrative, and arsenic products remained in circulation long after their dangers were known. Some victims attempted to stop using arsenic once symptoms became unbearable, but by then, the damage was often irreversible. Their complexions might have once drawn admiration, but now they faced skin eruptions, extreme fatigue, and systemic failure. Those who survived often bore permanent reminders of their choices: scarred skin, weakened organs, or a lifelong distrust of beauty products. And yet, new consumers continued to fall into the same trap, seduced by the illusion of effortless beauty. The cultural shift away from arsenic-based beauty came only with greater medical understanding and regulatory action. As laws began to catch up with science, many countries banned or restricted the use of arsenic in cosmetics. Manufacturers sought alternative ingredients, though not always safer ones. The legacy of arsenic lingered, however, both in the damaged bodies it left behind and in the continued idealization of pale, flawless skin. Today, arsenic is remembered more as a murder weapon or a cautionary tale than a cosmetic. Yet the story of its widespread use in beauty remains a chilling reminder of how societal standards can override common sense. The desire to fit in, to be seen as beautiful, to be admired, these pressures can push people toward unimaginable choices. And when those choices are marketed, normalized, and even romanticized, the consequences become even harder to resist. Modern parallels can still be found in today's beauty industry. Though arsenic has vanished from our vanities, the idea of risking health for appearance has not. Harsh chemical peels, extreme dieting, and unregulated injections echo the same desperation to meet impossible standards. The ingredients may have changed, but the underlying motivations often remain painfully familiar. History, in this case, serves not just as a mirror, but as a warning. The women who wore arsenic on their faces may have done so unknowingly, but their stories speak volumes about the costs of conformity. They were not vain caricatures, but individuals caught in a powerful current of expectation, doing what they thought was necessary to survive and succeed. Their suffering is not just a footnote in cosmetic history. It is a testament to the silent, invisible toll of beauty chased at any cost. We look back now and shake our heads, wondering how anyone could willingly apply poison in the name of elegance. But we must also look inward and ask whether we are so different. When filters, procedures, and harsh treatments dominate our feeds, are we not also chasing a pale but poisoned ideal? The medium has changed, but the message has not. Beauty is worth suffering for until it isn't. In the echoes of powder rooms and parlor mirrors, the ghost of arsenic still lingers, a haunting symbol of beauty turned deadly. It reminds us that the face we see in the mirror is shaped not only by our own choices, but by the expectations of the world around us. And sometimes those expectations carry a poison far deeper than any chemical, one that seeps into self-worth, identity, and the quiet desperation to be enough. Wearing dead animal organs to prevent aging. Wearing animal parts as a defense against the inevitable passage of time may sound like something born from folklore or fantasy, yet in certain chapters of history, it was very much a reality. Ancient civilizations, from the earliest tribal communities to more established empires, often engaged in bizarre, visceral rituals in the name of youth. The belief that vitality could be absorbed from another creature led to practices that would make even the most devoted modern beauty enthusiasts shudder. Among the strangest of these was the idea that wearing the organs of freshly killed animals could stave off aging. This wasn't merely decorative, it was believed to be medicinal, spiritual, and alchemical, an act of drawing life itself from the body of another. In remote regions where science had not yet reached or was still entangled in mysticism, hunters returning with animal trophies were sometimes revered not for the meat they brought home, but for the raw organs they carried. Elders, desperate to preserve what little strength and clarity they had left, would wrap animal intestines around their arms or wear freshly removed hearts inside amulets close to their chest. These organs, still warm, were seen as vessels of life force. It was thought that while the flesh might rot, the essence remained temporarily trapped within, offering a brief window to extract its power. The smell, the texture, the discomfort, it was all part of the perceived sacrifice, a necessary discomfort to reclaim one's youth. In certain circles, it was believed that wearing the liver of a wolf could improve eyesight and sharpen instinct, two attributes associated with youth. The liver, rich in iron and essential vitamins, was biologically beneficial when consumed, but instead of eating it, some chose to strap it across their lower back with animal sinew, or even embed it into specially designed belts worn under clothing. These hidden garments, soaked in the blood of the animal, were not to be removed until the organs had completely dried out. They were never reused. Once the life had drained, the charm was dead and needed to be replaced. During the early medieval period, particularly among isolated nobility and arcane practitioners, the fashioning of vitality cloaks became somewhat of a phenomenon. These cloaks weren't made from fur or hide, but sewn from the stitched together skins of specific animals, usually those thought to possess strength or longevity. The heart of a bear might be sewn into the shoulder lining, the pancreas of a young deer tucked under the collar, even the kidneys of goats were sometimes stitched near the hips, thought to preserve vitality and prevent thinning of the hair. These garments were often concealed beneath ceremonial robes, their presence known only to the wearer and their physician or alchemist. The belief wasn't always centered on strength. Some aimed to capture the gentleness and youthfulness associated with certain animals. The soft organs of lambs were believed to transmit a sense of purity and delay the hardening of the skin. Wearing such organs pressed against the skin, held in place by wraps or intricate bone clasps, was thought to keep the skin soft and ward off age spots. The younger the animal, the better the effect. In many ways, it was a disturbing echo of the obsession with youth, a desire so strong it turned people toward practices that blurred the line between medicine and superstition. Priests and holy healers in certain parts of the world crafted rituals around the replacement of these organ-based talismans. There were moonlit ceremonies where the old, desiccated organs were buried beside the roots of specific trees, believed to absorb the aged essence, while the fresh ones were bound in cloths of sacred color and strapped to the body. The act was often deeply symbolic. To wear the beating heart of a creature, even after its beat had stopped, was to challenge time itself. It was less about actual rejuvenation and more about defying mortality in a way that could be touched, worn, and performed. Historical records and travelogues from early explorers mention tribes deep in the jungles of Asia and South America that believed the soul of an animal lingered in its organs. The wearing of these parts was not merely for anti-aging. It was about inheritance. One might wear the brain of a monkey in a dried pouch around the neck, not for intelligence, but to maintain mental clarity in old age. A jaguar's heart might be worn to keep the blood strong and fearless, even as the body aged. These beliefs were passed down through generations, not as optional rituals, but as necessary rites of survival and dignity in the face of decay. The practice was not confined to the remote. In Renaissance Europe, amid growing fascination with anatomy and the hidden workings of the human body, physicians toyed with the idea that animal organs might possess transferable properties. While most respected academics of the time focused on dissection and study, a fringe group of experimentalists and aging nobles sought out underground surgeons who would implant thin animal membranes just beneath the skin. These were often harvested from pigs or calves and sewn in with the belief that the youthful elasticity of these animals could somehow merge with human tissue, slowing wrinkles and sagging. Some cultures saw the stomach as the seat of both emotion and youth. The idea that wearing the stomach lining of a healthy animal could control one's internal aging became widespread. Individuals would bind the lining across their torso, sometimes under layers of cloth, believing it would absorb toxins and negativity, thus preserving their emotional and physical health. In wealthier circles, these linings were perfumed and tanned, transformed into wearable layers not unlike modern shapewear, except far more grotesque in their origins. In Eastern traditions, particularly in ancient herbal and martial disciplines, the internal organs of animals were believed to possess qi, the life energy that flows through all living things. To retain youth, one had to nourish or replenish this chai. Practitioners often wore dried spleens and gallbladders from animals thought to have high energy, believing that even through dried contact, some trace of that energy could be absorbed through the skin. The organs were carefully dried using smoke from rare woods and herbs and worn as necklaces, bracelets, or stitched into waist wraps. The concept of drawing youth from the dead wasn't always as direct as wearing wet, fresh organs. Some aristocrats commissioned amulets or jewelry containing powdered organs, especially from exotic creatures like gazelles, lynxes, or snakes. These were often encased in glass or crystal, believed to amplify their metaphysical energy. The wearer might keep a small capsule of powdered liver sewn into a ring that touched the skin at all times. This contact, though minimal, was thought to influence the bloodstream subtly, infusing it with resilience and clarity. Over time, as medical understanding progressed, these practices became taboo or relegated to whispers and hidden societies, but their echoes remained. Even in more modern times, certain remote communities still preserved fragments of these rituals. A grandmother might whisper to her granddaughter that the reason her skin was still smooth was because once in her youth she had worn a rabbit's lung across her chest for an entire winter. Whether the claim held truth or not, it was carried with reverence, part of an inherited library of strange, flesh-bound knowledge. What may be most striking is how universal the desire was. From icy mountains to sunlit deserts, from palaces to jungles, the idea that another creature's life could prolong your own cut across boundaries of language, geography, and belief. The organs, slippery and short-lived as they were, became symbols of a war waged against time. Each time a new organ was bound to the body, it was a silent declaration, "I will not fade without a fight." In some cases, animals were bred and raised not for meat, milk, or labor, but for the preservation of their organs for such purposes. Special diets were fed to these animals in the belief that it would enrich the power of their organs. Young lambs were fed honey and crushed herbs, calves were allowed only certain mineral-rich water, and birds were raised in darkness to preserve the soul. These beliefs were so deeply ingrained that entire microeconomies formed around them. There were specialists who claimed to know the exact moment an organ reached peak vitality and had to be harvested within minutes to retain its youth-preserving power. Many people went to great lengths to acquire these organs, even if it meant traveling far distances. Merchants sold preserved animal organs soaked in oils or wrapped in resin-soaked cloth to ensure longevity. Aged nobles, fearful of their waning status and vitality, would pay handsomely for a heart that came from a wild creature freshly slain under the light of a specific moon phase. The more obscure the conditions, the greater the belief in its effectiveness. Although today such practices seem macabre or even delusional, they speak to a timeless fear, the fear of fading, of becoming less, of disappearing from the world before one is ready. When mirrors began to show skin that didn't bounce back, when joints ached and memory dulled, people reached out for anything, no matter how grotesque, that might allow them to reclaim their former selves, even if just for a little while. Modern cosmetic science may have replaced animal organs with serums, supplements, and surgical lifts, but the impulse is not so different. We still seek to extract vitality from external sources. We still fear aging not only as a biological process, but as a social decline. The centuries-old belief that life could be borrowed or worn still lingers beneath the surface of our anti-aging obsession. In dimly lit temples and behind velvet drapes in old estates, history whispers stories of those who clung to slivers of life through the organs of the once living. They were not madmen nor mere savages. They were people trying, in their own desperate, primal way, to hold back the tide of time. With each organ tied to their bodies, they wore not just muscle or membrane. They wore their hope, their longing, and their refusal to vanish into age's silent march. As generations passed, the techniques surrounding the use of animal organs to delay aging became more elaborate and theatrical. Rituals were no longer simple bindings or concealed amulets. They evolved into processions of identity and power. Some aristocrats began hosting secret gatherings where each guest wore a unique piece of organ-based attire, not for display but as part of a shared ceremony. In candlelit halls, the flicker of flames across glistening membranes, carefully stitched into robes, each one chosen from a specific beast thought to influence a different element of vitality: courage, beauty, strength, fertility, and memory. The clothing itself became a coded language, each embedded organ representing a personal ailment or vanity. A spine fragment from a boar might be hidden beneath a sash to ward off back stiffness. Small, mummified hearts from forest hares were tucked into pockets for calmness and preserved laughter. Those afflicted with trembling hands might attach a dried squirrel kidney to their sleeves, believing the creature's agility would flow through them. This wasn't considered superstition by the participants. It was the height of ancestral science, drawn from a lineage of observation and oral wisdom that held more authority in their minds than the ink of medical texts. In some cases, fashion and healing were merged with sensuality. Perfumes were created by steeping animal organs in floral oils, and these mixtures were applied to the inner thighs or collarbones of aging nobles. The logic was that the proximity to pulse points would allow the essence to be better absorbed. These scents were not for seduction, but for survival. Their wearers sought to fool both lovers and time itself, cloaking the scent of decline beneath a veil of sacred decay and aromatic illusion. While city dwellers often relied on traders to deliver these exotic components, rural families developed home-based methods of preservation. One particularly unsettling method involved packing fresh organs into clay pots along with herbs, then burying them beneath sleeping quarters. It was thought that as the organs decomposed, their remaining energy would rise as vapor through the soil, passing into the sleeper's body unnoticed. People slept atop this living grave fear, but with hope that each morning they would awaken a little firmer, a little clearer, a little more resistant to time's theft. Children were sometimes dressed in wraps containing dried animal spleens as preventative measures. Aging was viewed not just as something to be reversed, but as something that could be delayed from the very beginning. In these communities, wisdom meant nothing without endurance, and a long life was measured not in years, but in how little one's body betrayed it. The introduction of organs into a child's wardrobe was an act of parental love and foresight, a kind of biological blessing stitched with tenderness and anxiety. As the centuries progressed and borders shifted, these traditions traveled. In the sprawling trade routes of Central Asia, merchants swapped not only spices and textiles, but entire ideologies surrounding the transference of energy through animal remains. From these exchanges, new hybrids of belief were born. One group might believe that sleeping with an ox's tongue under your pillow granted youthful speech and eloquence. Another claimed that compressing your wrists with tiny organ pouches from owls would bring mental clarity. Some of these practices merged with early scientific curiosity, leading to more structured experimentation, though the results remained anecdotal at best. Interestingly, organs from birds were considered particularly potent. Their ability to fly symbolized transcendence, so their inner parts were seen as holding secrets of lightness and longevity. People wore shriveled avian hearts tied around their ankles, believing this would reduce swelling and keep the limbs nimble. The eyes of certain birds, preserved in herbal resins, were set into necklaces or brooches and worn close to the face to preserve vision. These amulets, glossy and opaque, gave the impression of a watching presence, as if the animal's sight continued even in death. In coastal regions, marine animals contributed their share of aging remedies. The bladders of specific fish, believed to hold buoyancy and balance, were dried and sewn into boots to maintain posture. Eel livers, slippery and dense, were layered into skin balms, intended to restore elasticity when rubbed into the cheeks or neck. Whale tissue, when obtainable, was prized beyond measure and handled only by certain practitioners believed to have been born under water-dominant astrological signs. At the core of many of these beliefs was an unshakable faith in the continuity of life, that nothing truly ended, it simply transferred. An organ removed from a beast wasn't seen as dying with it. Rather, it was in transit, waiting to bond with a new vessel. This philosophy transformed the body into an ecosystem that could be replenished with external parts, much like a broken structure reinforced with foreign beams and columns. The spiritual layer of these rituals added further depth. Elders sometimes whispered mantras into the organs before wearing them, ensuring that their intentions were etched into the flesh. Some believed the organs needed to know what they were being used for. Only then would they cooperate. Words of gratitude were often spoken to the animal spirit, sometimes with offerings left at shrines or buried with the organ's remains once their use had expired. Failure to do so was believed to curse the wearer with accelerated decay, a fear that ensured meticulous ritual observance. The obsession with prolonging youth through such grotesque yet deeply symbolic means sometimes led to dark, clandestine practices. In desperate times, the organs of endangered or sacred animals were harvested in secret, creating a black market that flourished behind temple walls and noble courtyards. Hunters and smugglers became unexpected arbiters of immortality, navigating networks that connected shamans, apothecaries, and aristocrats. The prices for a lion's liver or a crane's heart soared beyond gold, and yet people paid, believing that even a brief delay in aging was worth any cost. Even monarchs, bound by image and legacy, turned to these practices discreetly. Court physicians were often ordered to concoct mixtures containing slivers of dried animal heart blended into powdered minerals and teas. Some kings wore pouches inside their crowns, stuffed with the glands of creatures believed to enhance memory and strength. Queens, desperate to retain their allure, sometimes slept with veils laced with the preserved uteruses of foxes or gazelles, animals thought to embody grace and cunning. The fascination extended into art and literature as well. In illuminated manuscripts and hidden codices, one can find depictions of saints, witches, and healers adorned with belts of animal organs, walking serene through gardens of ageless bloom. These images were not dismissed as fantasy, but revered as representations of divine fusion between man and beast, time, and resistance. Even plays and poems subtly reference these traditions, wrapping them in allegory and metaphor to avoid censorship while keeping their meanings intact for those who understood. In colder regions, people believed the warmth of certain organs could counteract the harsh aging effects of the climate. They would wear freshly removed hearts under thick furs during long journeys, or place warm liver pieces inside their boots to keep circulation flowing. Hunters would sometimes pause not just to eat, but to press the organs of their catch to their faces, believing the fleeting heat would rejuvenate their skin and soul alike. This was no act of savagery. It was survival, elevated to ritual. As science marched forward and medicine began to understand disease, bacteria, and hygiene, these practices dwindled. Yet they didn't entirely vanish. Some were quietly folded into modern routines: animal-based creams, collagen supplements, organ extract serums. While the organs are no longer worn raw, the idea behind them lives on in sterilized bottles and neatly branded packages. The philosophy remains unchanged, that something from outside us, especially something once living, can slow what time insists on taking away. And so the memory of those who once wore livers like belts, who slept on kidneys beneath their floors, and who whispered wishes into drying hearts continues to echo. Their practices may no longer be visible, but the desire that birthed them is still here, now dressed in new language, cleaner lines, and subtler forms. Yet beneath it all remains the same raw yearning: to be timeless, to refuse disappearance, to outlive the boundaries carved by flesh and years. In the final shadows of fading empires and rural enclaves untouched by modern influence, there remained practitioners who guarded their ancestral techniques with unyielding devotion. These individuals, often labeled as herbalists or body savers, specialized in organ binding traditions that few dared speak of openly. They viewed each organ not as mere biological matter, but as a sacred container of temporal energy. Each procedure was timed with the lunar cycle, and meticulous care was taken in aligning the organ with the correct part of the human body. If worn incorrectly, say, a liver wrapped around the ankle rather than the lower back, it was believed the effect could be reversed, hastening wrinkles or internal fatigue. Silence was essential during these rituals. Many believed that speaking during the moment of binding would spill the spirit of the organ. The air had to be still, the breath steady, and the fabric used in the wrapping was often soaked in crushed leaves or bark known for their absorptive qualities. Those involved in the ritual entered a kind of meditative state, where the heartbeat of the wearer was consciously slowed, allowing what they called transferal equilibrium, the merging of vitality without resistance. Any pain felt during the process was interpreted as a sign of the organ's potency, not a symptom to fear. It was not uncommon for entire families to take part in these preparations. Children learned to extract delicate tissues from animals using curved bone knives, while elders taught which herbs to blend into the binding paste. The practice was as much about memory as it was about health. Passing down these methods ensured that a lineage maintained control over its aging, which was seen as a form of spiritual dominion. To die without ever having worn the sacred organ dressings was considered a failure of heritage. Different animals held different significance based on terrain and culture. In the tundra, the bladder of the Arctic fox was dried and turned into a pouch, then hung from the neck to guard against the brittle stiffness of age. In jungle regions, the pancreas of vibrant parrots was blended with resins and smeared along the spine, believed to energize the marrow. Across deserts, the lungs of swift-footed gazelles were worn over the chest, under layers of fine cloth to encourage better breathing in the dry heat. Each method bore the mark of centuries of fine-tuned adaptation to local conditions. Certain advanced techniques even included interchanging organs throughout the seasons. A spring protocol might call for the wearing of squirrel adrenal glands to awaken vitality after winter, while summer rituals involved binding hummingbird hearts, captured mid-flight and preserved quickly, to the pulse points to maintain rapid energy. Autumn called for kidney applications from forest boars to combat fatigue, and in winter, bare stomach linings were favored for maintaining inner warmth and digestion. These seasonal rotations mirrored natural cycles and underscored the belief that aging could be interrupted if one lived in alignment with the earth. In some cases, the integration of organ-based items went beyond garments or wearable forms. Entire beds were made from interwoven animal fibers with stitched pockets holding dried and pressed internal tissues beneath the pillows or mattress. Sleeping atop this life bed, as it was called, was believed to slowly imbue the body with continuous doses of preserved essence. These beds were expensive to make, and only the wealthiest or most devout could afford to replace the organs frequently enough to ensure lasting effect. The artistry behind the preparation of organs became a respected craft in itself. Drying the organs without damaging their structure required immense skill. Some were smoked in chambers with burning myrrh and pine. Others were preserved in oils drawn from mountain herbs. In some traditions, certain fish bladders were inflated and left to dry in the sun, their translucent skins later sewn into belts or veils that shimmered faintly when worn. This glow was interpreted as a visible sign of inner youth fighting its way to the surface. There were also collectors who dedicated their lives to acquiring the rarest organs known for their unique properties. These individuals, sometimes dismissed as eccentrics or mystics, traveled across continents in search of creatures whose organs were rumored to halt specific aspects of aging. One such tale speaks of a man who climbed high altitudes to obtain the eye sacs of albino vultures, which he ground into powder and wore beneath his eyelids to stave off clouded vision. Another account describes a woman who crossed seas to secure the stomach lining of a bioluminescent jellyfish, which she blended into her skincare to maintain nocturnal radiance. One of the most peculiar aspects of this tradition was the cultivation of emotional resilience through organ application. Not all organs were chosen for physical benefits. Some practitioners wore hearts from animals that exhibited loyalty, such as swans or wolves, to maintain emotional consistency and stave off the instability that sometimes accompanied old age. These organs were believed to stabilize mood and memory when pressed near the sternum. Such emotional preservation was as critical to the aging process as the prevention of gray hair or joint pain, especially in communities where elders played vital social roles. As time advanced, underground clinics began combining these age-old techniques with more contemporary methods. Secret laboratories beneath cities preserved organs using vacuum sealing, freeze drying, and chemical bathing. Though science outwardly dismissed these methods, there were whispered acknowledgments that ancient organ preservation bore similarities to the extraction of peptides and enzymes in modern anti-aging research. The line between myth and molecular truth had started to blur, but these efforts remained hidden from mainstream discussion, veiled under the term alternative biotherapeutics. Meanwhile, Certain monasteries that had kept to themselves for centuries continued the silent work of organ integration. In these secluded spaces, monks anointed each other with pastes made from ground tissues and recited chants while placing dried tendons across the forehead. These rituals were done with reverence, and the outcomes were documented in coded manuscripts that few outside the order could interpret. To those within the walls, these writings were a guide to outpacing time without betraying nature. Among seafarers, traditions took yet another form. Shark livers were highly sought after, believed to protect skin from the aging effects of salt water and wind. Sailors would stitch small fragments into their sleeves or line the inside of their boots. In more aggressive instances, sailors drank steeped concoctions made from dried heart valves of large sea creatures, hoping their bodies would become as unyielding as the ocean predators they admired. On land, nomadic desert dwellers turned to the organs of snakes and scorpions. Their venom sacs, once emptied and washed, were sewn into bracelets or earrings, thought to provide resilience against the stressors of extreme climate and time. It was believed that those who survived harsh conditions left an imprint of strength in their bodies, and wearing their organs offered a shortcut to enduring such hardship. As a result, age was no longer merely something to be feared, but something to be mastered through clever appropriation. In the end, what remains is a testament to humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender to the natural erosion of time. Across centuries and continents, the belief that vitality could be borrowed, absorbed, and worn has persisted, not because it was convenient or logical, but because it answered an ancient ache buried in the soul, the need to remain, to resist the vanishing, to stretch one more day into the realm of youth. Through the eyes of those who wore hearts upon their shoulders and stomachs near their ribs, aging was not a condition. It was a puzzle, and the answer might just lie in the quiet heartbeat of something that once lived. Mouse fur eyebrows and other hairy trends. In a time long before the precision of tweezers and the sleek finish of brow gels, beauty trends were dictated not by influencers, but by culture, superstition, and sheer eccentricity. Among the most bizarre and memorable of these trends was the peculiar practice of mouse fur eyebrows. It may sound like satire or theatrical exaggeration, but for many individuals in the 18th century, this was a genuine and fashionable solution to an all too common problem: the loss of natural eyebrows due to age, illness, or overplucking. Instead of drawing them on or leaving them bare, some turned to the soft pelts of small rodents, fashioning and gluing strips of mouse skin onto their faces to mimic the coveted arch of a perfect brow. The result was both surreal and, at times, unsettling, but it was considered refined, elegant, and even aristocratic. These fake brows were often made from the fur of freshly caught mice, meticulously shaped and aligned to match the standards of the day. They were attached using adhesives that were far from today's skin-safe glues, often involving sticky pastes or even tree sap, which came with their own issues: discomfort, reactions, or worse, the occasional slipping of an eyebrow mid-conversation. Eyebrows at the time were not simply facial features, but status symbols. The upper classes went to great lengths to ensure they presented themselves as refined and pristine, even if it meant adorning their faces with tiny pieces of rodent. The mouse fur eyebrow trend is emblematic of a larger pattern in beauty history, where hair, especially facial or body hair, became a canvas for cultural values and individual expression. Throughout the centuries, humans have waxed, plucked, painted, adorned, and even transplanted hair in astonishing ways. In ancient Rome, women used burnt cork to darken their eyebrows and eyelashes. In Elizabethan England, a high forehead was considered a sign of intelligence and nobility, so women plucked their hairlines back, sometimes to the crown of their heads. These drastic methods were not just about aesthetics. They reflected deeper societal beliefs about virtue, status, and femininity. Hair, in its many forms, became a tool for transformation. During the Renaissance, men and women alike wore wigs that could tower several inches high, powdered and adorned with feathers, jewels, or even miniature scenes like ships or gardens. In some cases, these wigs concealed baldness or lice infestations, turning a hygienic workaround into a luxurious statement. And yet, Just as quickly as these trends rose in popularity, they faded. The powdered wigs of the 1700s eventually gave way to natural hair as political revolutions swept through Europe, toppling monarchies and dismantling the opulence that such fashions represented. What's fascinating about trends like mouse fur eyebrows is how they speak to a human desire to cover perceived flaws, to project a sense of control over the uncontrollable, aging, disease, or social mobility. In an age without antibiotics or modern skincare, illnesses like syphilis could cause hair loss, particularly in the brows. Covering them with artificial replacements wasn't just vanity, it was about dignity, about maintaining a face that met society's standards. And this wasn't limited to Europe. In imperial China during certain dynasties, it was fashionable for women to shave their eyebrows entirely and paint them back on in artistic sweeping lines, sometimes in vivid blue or green pigment. The practice wasn't practical, but it was considered elegant. Fast forward to the Victorian era, and facial hair became a male-dominated symbol of masculinity and authority. Beards and mustaches were grown long and styled elaborately, with oils and waxes turning facial hair into sculptural statements. Meanwhile, women were expected to remove any trace of facial or body hair, often through harsh chemicals or painful manual plucking. These double standards evolved in complex ways. In the early 20th century, the rise of the flapper girl introduced these thin, dramatically arched eyebrows drawn on with pencil, creating an expression of constant surprise. This became iconic, influencing generations of makeup trends that followed. Even today, echoes of those earlier customs remain. The resurgence of eyebrow trends in recent decades, from ultra-thin brows in the 1990s to thick Instagram brows in the 2010s, shows that beauty standards are never fixed. They are fluid, reactive to culture, media, and innovation. And while mouse fur may no longer be considered fashionable, the essence of what it represented, a desire to correct, to enhance, to be seen as beautiful, continues to pulse through every tube of brow gel and every microbladed line. Hair as adornment hasn't only been limited to the face. In various African cultures, elaborate hair braiding and threading served as both a social identifier and an art form, communicating tribe, status, and age. Hair became language, woven not just for beauty, but to carry meaning across generations. Similarly, in Japan, the samurai's top knot was not merely a hairstyle, it was a declaration of identity and discipline. For geishas, hairstyles were intricately layered, symbolizing their rank and experience, with accessories that told a story at a glance. In more recent history, the 1960s and 70s brought about a cultural rebellion, and hair was central to that expression. Afros became a powerful political statement for Black identity, rejecting assimilationist norms. Long, uncut hair was worn by many in the counterculture movement as a rejection of conformity and war. Meanwhile, the punk era challenged norms with shaved heads, mohawks, and brightly colored hair, redefining what it meant to be beautiful, or deliberately not. What makes the tale of mouse fur eyebrows so strangely enduring is its combination of absurdity and sincerity. The people who wore them weren't trying to be ironic or grotesque, they were simply following the rules of their time. They saw beauty in symmetry, in fullness, in the illusion of youth and health. That they turned to tiny animals for assistance may strike us as strange now, but at the time, it was just another tool in the cosmetic toolbox. And if history teaches us anything, it's that today's oddity can be tomorrow's trend. There is also an underlying truth in how trends like this begin. Often they are not invented by the masses, but are introduced by elite circles, aristocrats, entertainers, or royals. Once the upper class embraces a certain look, it trickles down. Imitation follows admiration. Mouse fur eyebrows likely gained popularity because a well-known figure wore them first, turning what would have been otherwise unthinkable into a coveted trend. And with limited access to mirrors, photography, or critical self-viewing, appearance was shaped by social feedback and fleeting glimpses, not by selfies or viral videos. That left ample room for imagination and excess. As time marches on, beauty standards will continue to evolve, but the principles behind them remain consistent. The use of hair, natural or otherwise, as a symbol of power, allure, and identity endures. Whether it's gluing fur above the eyes, threading intricate patterns into the scalp, or bleaching and tinting for symmetry, These efforts reveal the deep human need to be seen, to be admired, to belong. They show how appearance is both personal and political, a reflection of the era's values as well as individual creativity. In today's world, the idea of wearing mouse fur on one's face would be considered theatrical at best or shocking at worst. But in its own era, it was a genuine solution to a social dilemma. With no retouching apps or brow pencils, people used what was available, and what was available, for some, happened to squeak. Beauty, in this light, becomes a record of human adaptation, often strange, sometimes humorous, but always deeply telling. Each follicle and each painted line carries with it a memory of who we were and what we hope to become. Beauty marks made of mouse skin patches. In the strange and often unsettling world of historical beauty practices, few trends were as peculiar and as revealing of societal ideals as the use of mouse skin patches to simulate beauty marks. These were not simply drawn on with coal or charcoal, but were, quite literally, small patches of rodent skin treated and shaped into hearts, stars, or dots, and then strategically applied to the face. While today this might evoke disgust or disbelief, in the past, these artificial marks carried powerful social and aesthetic meaning. Fashion, after all, has always been a mirror of the times, and these curious patches reflected a world obsessed with appearances, symbols, and silent communication. During the 17th and 18th centuries, when powdered wigs towered high and faces were painted pale with lead-based cosmetics, the appearance of the face was treated almost like a canvas, something to be sculpted, altered, and adorned. The beauty patch, or mouche as it was known in France, became a key element in this ritual of self-presentation. Far from being a minor accent, the placement, shape, and even material of the beauty mark could convey everything from romantic availability to political affiliation. And mouse skin, delicate, pliable, and eerily human-like in its fine texture, was often the material of choice for these statements. Harvested from the softest parts of small rodents, particularly the belly, the mouse skin was carefully cleaned, dried, and cut into decorative shapes. It was then glued onto the skin with an adhesive made from gum arabic or resin. These patches would be applied over blemishes or smallpox scars, but even unblemished skin could become a stage for them. What began as a form of concealment quickly evolved into a language of its own, a type of facial Morse code in elite circles. A patch at the corner of the eye suggested flirtation, while one near the mouth hinted at sensuality. If a woman wore hers near the temple, it might mean she was married. Even men took part in the trend, using patches to enhance their courtly persona or to align themselves with certain factions. The origin of this practice has its roots not only in aesthetics, but also in necessity. Europe during the 1600s and 1700s was periodically ravaged by outbreaks of smallpox, and many survivors were left with pitted scars. The pursuit of smooth, unblemished skin had long been a beauty ideal, and in the wake of an epidemic, patches became an ingenious method of hiding these imperfections. Over time, the marks became fashion statements in their own right, and the material used, particularly something as macabre as mouse skin, was almost irrelevant to the grandeur of the trend. However, wealth and eccentricity often went hand in hand, and the elite took pride in using the rarest or most delicate materials available, no matter how bizarre or unsanitary by today's standards. Wearing a patch of mouse skin wasn't simply a matter of taste, it was a kind of performance. Attending a ball or court gathering involved hours of preparation. The hair was powdered and styled into fantastical forms. The skin was smoothed with layers of lead paste, and beauty patches were applied like finishing touches to a painting. In some cases, a woman might wear more than one, turning her face into a constellation of cryptic messages. These messages were not lost on the sharp-eyed attendees of such events, like where gossip and interpretation were as much a part of the evening as music or dancing. What seems grotesque now, the idea of affixing rodent skin to the face, was not seen as disturbing at the time. On the contrary, it was a mark of wealth and refinement. Only those who could afford to maintain appearances at this level could engage in such elaborate rituals. Moreover, mice were abundant, and their use in cosmetics was just one of many ways animals were employed in the pursuit of beauty. From crushed beetles in rouge to whale fat in skin balms, the bodies of animals were often repurposed for cosmetic enhancement. In this context, mouse skin patches were not shocking, but simply another tool in the ornate beauty kits of the elite. The presence of beauty marks on faces during this period also became fodder for satire. Caricaturists and writers lampooned the fashion, portraying women with faces littered with patches to the point of absurdity. Satirical pamphlets circulated, mocking the vanity of those who wore a dozen or more patches, suggesting they were not concealing flaws, but rather decorating themselves like Christmas trees. Despite this ridicule, the trend persisted, its popularity refusing to fade for generations. There was something undeniably powerful about the patch. It was both shield and signal, hiding and revealing in the same breath. The practice was not confined to France or England. Versions of the beauty patch appeared in various European courts, though the materials might vary. In some places, silk or velvet patches were more common, but mouse skin remained particularly prized for its natural look. It blended into the powdered skin more seamlessly, lending an eerie realism to the mark. Some patches were even perfumed or infused with subtle fragrances, making them not just visual but sensory additions to one's presence. Crafting these patches became a minor industry in itself. Artisans who specialized in producing them would sell sheets of pre-cut designs, sometimes housed in decorative boxes like miniature books. Clients could select from stars, moons, teardrops, and hearts. There were even seasonal trends, with certain shapes gaining popularity during specific times of the year. The care taken in shaping and applying these patches reflected the high stakes of appearance in court society. A misaligned patch could suggest carelessness or even moral looseness. Each one was a small but potent act of self-curation. As medical science advanced and the understanding of hygiene and disease grew, many of these beauty practices fell out of favor. The use of lead cosmetics declined, wigs shrank, and the popularity of mouse skin patches waned. But they never fully disappeared from the cultural imagination. In some ways, their influence lingers in the beauty industry's enduring obsession with perfection, symmetry, and signaling through small details. The artificial mole, now applied with a pencil or sticker, owes its ancestry to these macabre little accessories of the past. What's especially fascinating is the level of intimacy and discomfort that the practice forces us to confront. Beauty in this era was not just a surface concern, it was a full-body commitment. Women and men subjected themselves to toxic chemicals, painful procedures, and the use of animal parts in a desperate bid to conform to ever-shifting ideals. The mouse skin patch is a perfect symbol of this paradox. A tiny piece of death placed on the face to enhance the illusion of life and allure. It is both elegant and grotesque, meaningful and absurd. In the candlelit corridors of palaces and salons, where every glance could be a judgment and every gesture a form of communication, the beauty patch was a tool of survival. For women in particular, whose societal value was often tied to appearance and marital prospects, these small additions could make a significant difference in how they were perceived. The mouse skin may have been hidden in plain sight, but its presence was never accidental. It was deliberate, strategic, and loaded with intent. Today, when we look at old portraits from this period, we might notice a faint dot near the lip or cheek and think little of it. But behind that dot lies a rich, strange history, one of status games, bodily risk, and the constant negotiation of identity through appearance. The mouse skin patch is not just an odd footnote in the annals of beauty. It is a window into the complexity of human self-expression, the hunger for approval, and the sometimes surreal lengths to which people will go to be seen, desired, and remembered. Medieval bathing myths, dirt as a health strategy. In the winding, narrow alleys of medieval towns, the scent of wood smoke mingled with livestock and human sweat, creating a pungent blend that was as common as cobblestones. But contrary to what we might expect, many people during the Middle Ages did not see this lack of cleanliness as a problem. In fact, dirt itself was often embraced, viewed not only as harmless, but in some cases as protective. The notion of washing away grime was not always considered a benefit to health, and for a time, the unwashed body was thought to be a natural defense against disease. The idea of bathing was not abandoned entirely, but it became heavily distorted by fears, religious beliefs, and practical challenges that redefined cleanliness in surprising ways. Throughout much of the medieval period, water was considered a suspicious element. While it was essential for drinking and cooking, prolonged contact with water, particularly warm water, was believed to weaken the body and open its pores to corrupt air, known as miasma. This invisible cloud of disease was thought to seep into the body through these vulnerable pores, carrying illness and spiritual decay with it. As such, people feared that washing too often made them more susceptible to plagues, fevers, and misfortune. In many regions, physicians warned against frequent bathing, advising instead that it was better to remain dry, warm, and cloaked in layers of protective fabric and filth. Adding to this belief was the religious view that equated physical purity with vanity and spiritual danger. Early Christian teachings emphasized modesty, humility, and the rejection of worldly pleasures. Bathing, especially in public bathhouses or communal settings, was associated with indulgence and even sin. Monastic life, which held great influence over medieval culture, promoted asceticism, and this included the rejection of regular bathing. Some monks went years without a single full-body wash, believing that such sacrifices brought them closer to God. To be unclean in body was not seen as moral failure. It was an offering of discipline, a resistance against pride. Medieval medicine further complicated things. Based on humoral theory, the body was believed to be governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and any imbalance caused disease. Water, being cold and wet, was feared to disrupt this balance. Doctors of the time often prescribed dry rubbing, fumigation with herbs, or even wearing aromatic sachets to ward off illness, rather than suggesting a bath. In this framework, a layer of sweat, oil, and dust was interpreted not as neglect, but as a seal against external harm. Clothing, never laundered but frequently layered, trapped heat and smells, believed to protect vital energies. People wore the same undergarments for weeks, occasionally changing the outer layers for special occasions or rituals. Urban centers, especially as they grew in population, only reinforced these habits. Cities were crowded and chaotic, with poor drainage systems and shared wells, meaning water sources were easily contaminated. Public bathhouses, once popular during Roman times, slowly transformed from centers of hygiene into breeding grounds for disease, and worse, centers of moral decay. The rise of syphilis and other infectious diseases turned many bathhouses into places of suspicion. In response, laws were passed in several cities that either shut down bathhouses or heavily restricted their use. With this, the act of bathing fell even further into social disrepute. Rural life was no cleaner. In villages and countryside estates, water had to be hauled from rivers, wells, or rain barrels. Heating water required effort and resources many peasants simply could not spare. A full bath was not only labor-intensive but impractical. Spot cleaning was more common, especially hands and faces, but even that was done with care not to overindulge. Some used cloths soaked in vinegar or alcohol to wipe the body, both for their supposed cleansing properties and their ability to mask odors. Hair was rarely washed, instead powdered, braided, or hidden under hoods, caps, or veils to disguise dirt and oil. Children were introduced early to the concept that dirt was not the enemy. Playing in mud, sleeping in shared beds, and working alongside animals were all part of daily life. A bit of filth was simply expected. Babies might be wiped down occasionally, but bathing infants too often was believed to weaken their constitution. Mothers and midwives sometimes rubbed newborns with oil and dusted them with herbs, but immersion in water was infrequent. These customs passed from generation to generation, reinforcing the belief that skin caked with the residue of hard work and rural air was not a danger, but a badge of ordinary life. During times of plague, such as the Black Death, this belief in the protective power of dirt only deepened. People covered themselves in thick clothing, closed their shutters, and avoided bathing altogether for fear of opening themselves to the infected air. Physicians wore long robes and beaked masks filled with fragrant herbs, but they too avoided bathing during outbreaks. Clean skin, they thought, was vulnerable. A greasy, grimy exterior was imagined to trap foul air and keep it from penetrating the body. In desperation, some smeared themselves with animal fat, believing it could block out deadly vapors. Others filled their homes with smoke or incense, trying to cleanse the air without ever touching water. Despite all of this, there were exceptions. In warmer regions like parts of the Islamic world or southern Europe, where Roman bathing traditions lingered, Some continued to value water for its health benefits. Translations of classical texts encouraged occasional bathing as part of a balanced life, and wealthy nobles sometimes had private bath chambers with heated pools. But even then, these practices were inconsistently adopted and often met with skepticism by those steeped in Northern European customs. Smells, too, were redefined. Rather than seeing body odor as something unpleasant to be removed, it was sometimes interpreted as a sign of one's natural temperament or even moral character. A musky scent might indicate virility. A sour odor could reveal an imbalance of humors. Perfumed cloths or pomanders were used not to eliminate smell entirely, but to blend it with something more socially acceptable. In noble courts, it was common to carry small bouquets or scented objects to hold under the nose, not because others were clean, but because they were not. The Renaissance brought some renewed interest in classical hygiene, but many medieval attitudes persisted well beyond the Middle Ages. The idea that bathing was potentially harmful survived into the early modern period, especially during outbreaks of new diseases. Even royalty hesitated to wash frequently. One French monarch was famously said to have only bathed a handful of times in his life. His doctors assured him this was the path to good health. Courtiers followed suit, powdering their wigs and dabbing their skin with scented oils rather than risking exposure to water. What's most fascinating about these beliefs is how thoroughly they were internalized across every layer of society. From peasant to prince, the idea that cleanliness was risky shaped decisions about how people lived, dressed, and interacted. Hygiene was more symbolic than practical, a matter of spiritual balance, humoral stability, and social identity. Bathing was not always about being clean, but about navigating a world full of invisible dangers with the best tools people thought they had at the time. In hindsight, these medieval views might appear misguided or even absurd, but they made a certain sense within their own frameworks. Without knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or germ theory, people turned to what they could observe and feel. When clean people died just as often during plagues as dirty ones, cleanliness lost its persuasive power. And so, dirt endured as a strategy, one woven into belief, fear, and necessity. The grime of the medieval world wasn't simply tolerated, it was embraced, protected, and in some ways, some revered. It took centuries of scientific advancement to challenge these long-standing myths. The arrival of germ theory, advances in plumbing, and the development of soap finally began to shift public opinion. But the stubborn link between dirt and health had deep roots, and those roots were watered by centuries of experience, desperation, and devotion. The story of medieval hygiene is not just one of ignorance, but one of survival, where sometimes the absence of water was seen as the safest choice of all. Leech therapy, medieval detox gone too far. In a time when science bowed to superstition and medicine often resembled ritual more than remedy, the medieval world clung to ideas rooted more in belief than biology. Among the most bizarre and widely embraced of these treatments was leech therapy, a practice that took the concept of detoxification to an extreme few today could imagine. This method, primitive yet meticulously practiced, was believed to balance the body's internal humors and rid it of impurities by drawing blood, one drop at a time, through the use of living, wriggling leeches. These small, unassuming creatures were not just medical tools, but esteemed participants in the dance between life and death, sickness and salvation. Leeches, specifically the species Hirudo medicinalis, were considered miraculous creatures in medieval Europe. Their natural ability to latch onto human flesh and extract blood without causing immediate pain fascinated early physicians. This quality alone elevated them to the center of medical treatments. But their popularity was not merely due to their physical capabilities. It was tied directly to the theory of the four humors, which dominated medical thought in Europe for centuries. According to this framework, health was a balance between blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Any disruption in this equilibrium was thought to lead to illness, and blood was considered the most volatile of the four. Removing it was often the first and most aggressive line of treatment. What began as a symbolic act of purification quickly turned into a mainstream practice, applied not only in desperate moments of affliction, but as a routine part of wellness for the wealthy. Physicians, both respected and self-proclaimed, would prescribe bloodletting using leeches for ailments as varied as fevers, headaches, melancholia, indigestion, and even lovesickness. Nobles might undergo regular leech treatments not because they were ill, but because they wished to avoid illness altogether. In this twisted logic, the act of bleeding was thought to be preemptive. If disease stemmed from excess or imbalance, then surely removing blood would maintain harmony. And so, leeches found themselves summoned not merely to treat symptoms, but to act as guardians of the body's invisible internal war. The process itself was far from glamorous. The leech would be carefully placed on a patient's skin, often after the area was washed with milk or pricked to encourage attachment. Once in place, the creature would begin its silent work, its tiny jaw slicing through skin, releasing an anticoagulant known today as Hirutin, and drawing blood into its pulsing, expanding body. A single leech could drink several times its own weight in blood. Doctors monitored the feeding, sometimes leaving the leeches to gorge for up to an hour, or removing them prematurely to avoid excessive bleeding. What followed the removal, however, could be just as dangerous. Because Hirutin prevented clotting, wounds continued to seep, leading to blood loss that could become serious if multiple leeches were used. Despite the obvious risks, few questioned the practice. In a world without antibiotics, painkillers, or surgical precision, leech therapy offered something that other treatments lacked: the illusion of control. While other ailments seemed to spiral beyond human comprehension, here was a visible act of intervention, one that felt ancient, mystical, and purposeful. As patients watched their blood flow into these creatures, many genuinely believed they were witnessing the expulsion of illness itself. It was a powerful psychological salve in a time when death lurked close in every village, behind every cough, beneath every fever. Moreover, leech therapy wasn't confined to the hands of physicians alone. Barbers, who doubled as surgeons in many medieval communities, often handled bloodletting. Their red and white poles, still iconic today, are remnants of this dual responsibility: red for blood, white for bandages. These barbers would keep leeches in glass jars, stored in cool, damp places to prolong their usefulness. The creatures were handled with care and, in some cases, even passed down through generations. They became part of the healer's toolkit, as essential as the blade or the salve. In this ecosystem of makeshift medicine, the leech was both tool and talisman. The therapeutic use of leeches extended beyond humans as well. Livestock, prized for their role in agriculture and transport, were also subjected to leech therapy when showing signs of malaise. Ailing oxen or horses might be bled under the assumption that their humors too had fallen out of balance. This cross-species application underscored how deeply ingrained the belief had become. If blood was the river through which health flowed, then leeches were the dams and diversions that could prevent the flood of illness. Still, not all patients survived their encounters with the creatures. Overzealous treatments, particularly those involving dozens of leeches at once, could lead to catastrophic blood loss. In the hands of inexperienced or overly enthusiastic practitioners, the therapy became lethal. Fainting, delirium, and even death were not unheard of. Yet, rather than condemn the practice, many blamed the patient's underlying condition or believed the illness too severe to be reversed. The leeches in this narrative remained blameless. They were the last hope, not the final blow. Interestingly, leeches also made their way into religious institutions. Monasteries, often custodians of both knowledge and healing, cultivated medicinal gardens alongside their collections of leeches. In firm alignment with spiritual doctrines of penance and purification, the shedding of blood was viewed as a physical reflection of inner cleansing. The patient, stripped of excess blood, was also symbolically shedding vice and corruption. In some interpretations, the leech was seen as an earthly agent for divine correction, purging not only the body but the soul. Despite the popularity of leech therapy, it was not without controversy even in its heyday. Some scholars, particularly those exposed to translated Greek and Arabic texts, began to question the overuse of bloodletting. They observed that frequent bleeding could lead to weakness and worsen symptoms. Still, these voices of caution were often drowned out by tradition, authority, and the sheer weight of precedent. In an age where deviation from accepted norms was equated with ignorance or heresy, challenging the status quo carried more than just academic risk. The practice continued into the Renaissance and even the Enlightenment, bolstered by physicians desperate for answers and by patients eager for solutions. The Enlightenment brought with it a surge of anatomical studies and medical advancement, but curiously, leech therapy endured. In fact, the 19th century saw a resurgence in leech use, particularly in France, where leeches were exported by the millions. The obsession reached such heights that leech populations began to dwindle due to overharvesting. What had started as a humble folk practice had now become a full-scale commercial industry, with leech farms springing up to meet demand. Apothecaries stocked them in jars, and doctors prescribed them like pills. As with most medical fads, however, leech therapy eventually waned. The discovery of germ theory, the advent of antiseptics, and the rise of modern pharmacology cast long shadows over earlier practices. Slowly but surely, the notion that illness could be bled out lost its grip. Hospitals moved towards sterile procedures and internal treatments. Leeches, once treasured and hoarded, found themselves discarded or relegated to the pages of medical oddity. And yet the story doesn't end there. In an unexpected twist of history, leeches have made a small but notable comeback in modern medicine. Today, their use is carefully controlled and rooted in precise clinical contexts. Microvascular surgeries, particularly those involving reattachment of severed fingers or tissues, can benefit from the anticoagulant properties of leech saliva. By improving blood flow and preventing clotting in delicate, stitched vessels, leeches have earned a new, albeit niche, respect in the world of advanced healthcare. They are no longer agents of medieval detox, but instruments of modern precision. Used sparingly under rigorous regulation, they continue to serve the body, not as mysterious purifiers, but as biological tools. Still, the medieval obsession with leech therapy remains a powerful reminder of how easily desperation can blur the lines between treatment and torment. It speaks to the human longing for certainty in the face of suffering, for rituals that offer comfort when science falls silent. The story of leech therapy is not just about a creature, it's about a worldview, a society grappling with mortality using the only tools it could trust. At the heart of it all was a belief that nature, in all its crawling, biting, and bleeding forms, held answers that human hands could only hope to grasp. To the medieval mind, the leech was not grotesque, it was sacred. It was the whisper of salvation in a world ruled by shadows. And though we now look back with skepticism, perhaps even revulsion, we must also acknowledge the courage of those who endured such methods. For in their pain, there was hope. In their blood, a quest. And in the mouth of the leech, a desperate attempt to wrest control from chaos. As the medieval period stretched onward, leeches became more than a treatment. They were woven into the cultural identity of medicine itself. Their application became a form of status signaling, especially among the nobility, who took comfort in the ritualistic aspect of the therapy. A nobleman preparing for winter might order a bleeding session, not out of illness, but out of the belief that seasonal transitions stirred up the bodily humors. Physicians would respond with leather pouches filled with live leeches, kept cool in damp cloth to prolong their activity. The leeches, squirming and waiting, were treated with a reverence almost bordering on superstition. Even the containers they were stored in became ornate, often carved from ivory or sealed with symbols thought to enhance their healing powers. In some regions, entire local economies benefited from the collection and sale of leeches. Peasants, desperate for income, would wade into marshlands and ponds with bare legs, allowing the creatures to latch on so they could later be removed and sold. This practice was dangerous, often leading to severe infections or anemia among those who made a living from it. But such was the demand that these human bait collectors became a staple of the rural medical supply chain. Their work, grim and largely invisible, fed the elite's desire for therapeutic bleeding. Beyond physical health, some also believed leeches could influence mental and emotional stability. Anxiety, rage, and deep sorrow were often interpreted as signs of a corrupted inner state, not unlike a fever or infection. Placing leeches near the temples or behind the ears was a common response to mood disturbances. The slow draw of blood was imagined to calm the storm within, offering relief through subtraction rather than addition. The idea that purification could lead to peace was not exclusive to the body, it extended into the realm of the mind. Children were not exempt from these methods either. In an effort to prevent developmental issues or expel perceived congenital imbalances, infants were sometimes subjected to leech therapy under the direction of concerned midwives or priests. Tiny leeches, specially selected for their size, would be applied to soft areas like the inner arms or neck. The cries of a child undergoing such a procedure were seen as evidence that the evil was leaving, the imbalance corrected. Though disturbing by modern standards, this belief in preemptive bleeding reflected the fear parents held of mysterious childhood illnesses, which often struck without warning or explanation. Medical texts from the time were filled with elaborate diagrams showing where leeches should be placed, depending on the affliction. Some drawings displayed human figures with annotated zones, each one tailored to specific organs, spirits, or sins. These guides were copied by hand, passed between scholars and healers, each interpreting the leech not only as a remedy, but as a sacred instrument that required knowledge and discipline to wield correctly. Mistakes in placement or duration were feared, as improper use could be fatal. The leech became a symbol not only of healing, but of mastery, proof that the practitioner understood the body's secrets. Interestingly, leech therapy intersected with astrology. Practitioners often consulted celestial charts to determine the best time to bleed a patient. The position of the moon, the alignment of planets, and the patient's birth sign were all weighed before a leech was ever summoned. If Saturn was dominant, or if the moon waxed too strongly, a delay might be advised. The timing of the procedure was believed to influence its success, as if cosmic rhythms flowed through the bloodstream. This blending of medicine and mysticism shaped much of the era's approach to healing, and leeches were at the very center of that intersection. Some healers took this further, developing what they called sympathetic bleeding, a concept wherein leeches were applied to animals or volunteers, the idea being that the sickness would leave the primary sufferer and transfer into the surrogate. Though no results confirmed its effectiveness, the practice was undertaken in great earnest, especially when nobles or royalty fell ill. In such cases, anything that might offer relief was embraced, no matter how illogical it seemed. While much of this took place in Europe, other regions had their own interpretations of leech use. In parts of the Islamic world, leeches were applied with extreme precision, and their behavior was documented with near scientific detail. Scholars observed the rate at which a leech fed, the consistency of blood it removed, and even the color change in its body as it swelled. These notes were kept in medical manuscripts that combined empirical observation with traditional beliefs. Though the theoretical foundation remained tied to humoral balance, the meticulousness of these records suggested a gradual movement toward a more observational form of healing. In some cases, particularly among traveling apothecaries, leeches were also ground up and added to potions. It was thought that ingesting leech-based remedies could amplify their internal cleansing properties. These brews were bitter, dark, and often mixed with herbs meant to calm the stomach. Though few such mixtures endured the test of time, they show how deeply people wanted to believe that illness could be fought from both inside and out, through bleeding, drinking, and spiritual reflection. Of course, not everyone embraced leeches with the same fervor. Skepticism, though often silenced, lingered in corners of academia and among the lay population. Some patients dreaded the sight of the squirming creatures and refused treatment, even at risk of punishment. A few physicians began to explore alternative methods such as herbal purging, baths, or even fasting, believing that the reliance on bleeding had grown excessive. These quiet rebels within the medical community were often dismissed as radicals, yet they laid the groundwork for the gradual pivot away from bloodletting. During outbreaks of plague, leeches were used indiscriminately, as physicians sought any method to stave off death. Entire families were bled in the hopes of warding off the illness, with some houses losing more blood to leeches than to the disease itself. And when patients still perished, leeches were rarely blamed. Instead, they were seen as having made a valiant effort, tiny warriors that had tried to turn the tide. Their failure was accepted as a sign that the disease had been too powerful, rather than the method too weak. By the time Europe entered the modern age, public opinion began to shift. Satirical plays and pamphlets mocked the overuse of bloodletting, portraying physicians as foolish leech wielders who drained more life than they saved. But these critiques only grew louder once statistics began to show the ineffectiveness of such treatments. Medical academies, once the staunch defenders of leech therapy, slowly distanced themselves, replacing the creatures with cleaner, quantifiable techniques. Needles, thermometers, and laboratory testing began to take precedence. Leeches, once heroes of the healing chamber, faded into obscurity. Yet the symbolic power of the leech did not vanish. In literature, they became metaphors for greed, for clinging, for unseen forces that extract vitality without consent. They crept into language, appearing in idioms and curses. But for all the negative connotations, their legacy remained intact in one undeniable way. They had been humanity's companion in suffering, for better or worse. They had drawn blood not in violence, but in the name of salvation. Today, when surgeons use leeches in microsurgery, there is a sense of poetic full circle. These ancient tools, refined by evolution and feared by centuries of patience, now play a precise and vital role in saving limbs and lives. Under sterile conditions, with close monitoring and single-use protocols, leeches have found a place once more in medicine, not because of tradition, but because of proof. Their saliva, long a subject of curiosity, is now understood for its anticoagulant and anesthetic properties. Science has caught up with superstition, and in doing so, offered these creatures a strange kind of redemption. Even so, the history of leech therapy remains a cautionary tale. It warns against placing too much trust in methods that feel right, but lack true understanding. It reminds us that even the most accepted treatments may one day be seen as cruel. And perhaps importantly, it shows that desperation can make people accept anything, so long as it promises hope. The leech, in all its slime and silence, became a mirror to that hope, distorted though it may have been. Through centuries of practice, ritual, and belief, the leech bore witness to the fear and faith that shaped medieval health. And though its reign has largely passed, the memory of its role remains, a living thread connecting ancient instinct with modern precision. In that dark era, people believed the body held poisons that only bloodletting could release, and so they reached for the leech, again and again, certain that in its bite was the path to balance. Burnt almonds and boiled bones for hair growth. In the winding lanes of forgotten apothecaries and ancient homes, where healing recipes passed down through whispers and observation rather than books, there once lived a curious belief that the charred remains of almonds and the softened gristle from boiled bones held the power to awaken hair that had long since stopped growing. It might sound unusual now, even borderline absurd to modern ears trained in science and sterile formulations, but this combination was no joke to the people of old. They treated these rituals with reverence, not because they were naive, but because they were persistent seekers of remedies in a world where medicine was often a matter of imagination and experience. Almonds, once roasted to the point of blackened bitterness, were crushed into soot and stored in little cloth pouches or ceramic jars. This carbon-rich ash, according to traditional belief, was thought to stimulate dormant hair follicles when massaged into the scalp, as if the residue of fire itself could reignite what nature had paused. These almonds, sometimes soaked before roasting to enhance their burnability, were chosen not just for their availability, but for their symbolic meaning: fertility, richness, inner vitality. Burning them down in a poetic sense was like distilling their very soul, leaving behind only the essence that would then be coaxed into the skin. Women and men alike would gather in the cool corners of their kitchens or by the warm light of flickering lamps to grind the blackened remains on stones until the powder was as soft as flour, their fingers stained with the scent of smoke and nut oil. This powder was sometimes mixed with oils, sesame, castor, or even animal fat, to form a thick paste, sticky and dark, a strange yet sacred mask to be worn atop the head in silence. The scalp, often scrubbed raw beforehand with coarse cloth or even sand, was the canvas for this potion. Painful as it sounds, this roughness was intentional. They believed hair would only grow where there was fresh blood flow, as if growth was an offering made only when sacrifice preceded it. But it wasn't just the burnt almonds that made this ritual complete. The second half of the recipe, perhaps more macabre, was the broth of boiled bones. Bones were not easy to come by unless you were a butcher, a hunter, or someone who knew where to look after feasts. Long bones from goats, cows, or even chickens were collected with care, stripped of meat, and washed in streams or clay pots. These bones were not discarded, they were treasures. Boiled for hours, often with vinegar or acidic fruit juices to help release the gelatinous marrow, the resulting concoction was not for eating but for bathing the scalp. The logic was consistent with the wisdom of their time. If bones held strength and density, surely their essence could lend those same qualities to weak hair. This broth, once cooled, became part of a longer ceremony. People would ladle the thick, cloudy liquid over their heads, letting it soak the roots of their hair, imagining that strength was seeping into every follicle like moisture into dry earth. It is fascinating to consider how they arrived at this belief. Was it trial and error, desperation, or perhaps simple observation of how gelatin made skin supple, how heat opened pores, how ash seemed to draw impurities from the skin? They had no microscopes, no labs, no double-blind tests, just experience, memory, and the stories of elders. And those stories were powerful. One woman would claim her husband's hair returned after months of burnt almond paste and bone broth applications. Another would swear her daughter's bald patches filled in once she mixed goat marrow with ground date seeds. The anecdotes were the data, and repetition over generations turned guesses into convictions. Even the smells became familiar. The rich char of nuts, the sour scent of boiling collagen, the tang of coppery herbs added for good measure. Children would watch these rituals wide-eyed, memorizing the movements of their mothers, hearing phrases like "feed your roots" or "wake the sleeping strands." And as they grew, they would inherit the task of mixing and applying, learning not only the ingredients but the rhythm, the pace of stirring, the temperature of water, the texture of the perfect paste. It was more than just a beauty treatment. It was a family rite, something personal, hopeful, and sacred. It wasn't uncommon to hear of people walking for miles to reach a specific old woman known for her bone broths, or a man reputed to burn almonds in a way that preserved their potency. Their services were requested with both desperation and reverence, as if they were gatekeepers to a deeper, older knowledge, forgotten by the world, but preserved in the smoky folds of tradition. The idea that hair loss was not just cosmetic, but symbolic added urgency to these practices. In many societies, hair represented youth, fertility, health, and even spiritual power. To lose it was to lose more than appearance. It was to lose identity, status, and even perceived favor from unseen forces. So when modern medicine was not an option and prayers seemed unanswered, people turned to the earth and fire, to nuts and bones, to rituals forged in soot and patience. There were regional variations too. In some places, burnt almond paste was blended with crushed rose petals or dried mint leaves to soften the scent and add a cooling effect. In others, the bone broth was reduced further until it became a jelly, stored in clay pots and applied like an ointment. Some even smoked the scalp with the fumes of burning almond shells while applying the bone mixture, combining fire and steam to open the skin and allow the nutrients in. Despite the lack of evidence by today's standards, what can't be denied is the commitment behind these acts. To stand over a fire for hours, roasting almonds to just the right point before carbonization, to strip bones clean and boil them under the sun or by moonlight, catching the fat, saving the residue, letting none of it go to waste. To trust in a process that gave no guarantee but demanded time, labor, and faith. These weren't casual beauty routines, they were labors of belief. And the results, whether psychological or physiological, gave people hope. Hope that they could turn the tide of aging. Hope that they could restore what illness or time had taken. Hope that the answers they sought were already buried in the world around them, waiting to be ignited by fire and drawn out by steam. It wasn't just rural folk either. Even in ancient cities where trade routes brought silks and spices, where the wealthy could afford perfumed oils and imported remedies, some still clung to the burnt almond and bone method. There was a sense that these local, grounded solutions were more honest, more natural, more in tune with the body's rhythms. They weren't mass-produced. They weren't for sale in every market stall. They had to be made by hand. And in making them, the practitioner became part of the cure. The effort was part of the ritual. And in that act of creation, burning, boiling, crushing, applying, there was meaning. While many of these practices have faded into obscurity, their echoes remain in unexpected corners of modern tradition. Some barbers still speak of ancestral recipes passed through generations, whispering about relatives who swore by ash-based rubs or marrow-infused scalp oils. These aren't tales invented for curiosity, they're living fragments of history preserved in memory. Often, the process began not with the ingredients themselves, but with the mindset of preparation. Participants treated the act with almost ceremonial seriousness, believing that intention and emotion could influence the effectiveness of a remedy. A calm environment, respectful silence, and focused thoughts were part of the ritual, as important as the paste being prepared. Certainly. Here's the text repeated as is. Interestingly, it wasn't only the almonds that were used. The skins of the nuts were sometimes dried separately and singed into crisp flakes before grinding. Some claimed the skins held a subtler energy, lighter, yet more penetrating. The scent that rose from them during combustion was bitter and earthy, clinging to the walls of kitchens and bathing huts. The powdered mix from this lighter burn was stored in tightly sealed bone jars or goat leather pouches to maintain freshness. It was believed that improper storage would let the power escape, leaving only dust behind. That's how earnestly people clung to the process. Not only did the preparation require precision, but the care afterward was equally vital. Boiling bones also followed strict unspoken rules. There were preferences regarding the type, age, and condition of the animal. The bones of younger animals were seen as more potent, rich in life and nutrients, while older bones were avoided for fear they carried decay. Bones from hunted animals were revered as these were thought to be imbued with wild strength, whereas bones from domesticated beasts were gentler in effect. The broth wasn't simply cooked, it was watched. Foam that surfaced had to be skimmed immediately, and any trace of blood was filtered away. Impurities, even the smallest flecks, were thought to cloud the spiritual effectiveness of the liquid. The finished broth had a thick, slick consistency that cooled into a gelatin-like state if left untouched. People would often reheat it gently before use, never boiling it a second time, as repeated heat was believed to weaken its essence. In rare cases, the gelatin was mixed with crushed herbs known for their stimulating effects, wild thyme, dried hibiscus, or spikenard. These additions brought not only aroma, but symbolic balance. The goal was to harmonize fire, earth, and water through each application, creating a complete circuit of restoration for the scalp. Each person modified the mixture based on intuition or family guidance, creating personal variations that could not be replicated outside of their home. Even the act of application had layers. The fingers used to apply the paste were not always bare. In some traditions, animal hide gloves were worn to prevent the handler's energy from interfering with the mix. In others, only the right hand was permitted to apply, the left being reserved for cleansing. Massages were slow and deliberate, moving in circles believed to mimic the cycle of hair growth. Some people would sing or hum during application, not out of joy, but as a way to stay connected to the act and maintain consistency in rhythm. It was as much a practice of mindfulness as it was of medicine. Sometimes elders would perform the treatment on younger family members as a gesture of care. These moments created intimate bonds across generations, young children sitting cross-legged while their grandmothers dipped cloths into warm bone liquid, gently patting it on the scalp, whispering stories of when they too had once sat there, heads bowed and hearts hopeful. The trust built in those silent exchanges was perhaps more restorative than the mixture itself. There was something deeply comforting in the familiarity of it, the quiet repetition across decades, turning pain into patience and memory into legacy. Burnt almonds had another role beyond direct application. They were occasionally used as offerings. Tiny bowls of blackened almond powder were placed near bedside windows or household shrines as prayers for beauty and restoration. They symbolized dedication to natural healing, a plea to unseen forces to preserve youth and dignity. This layer of meaning added gravity to the practice. It was not just about growing hair, but about reconnecting with lost strength, recovering balance in life, and undoing what time or misfortune had taken away. The hair, in this sense, was a visible symbol of invisible resilience. Certain practitioners claim that the treatment worked best during specific lunar phases. The waxing moon was considered a time for growth and renewal, making it ideal for applying these remedies. Conversely, the waning moon was avoided, as it was thought to pull away energy, undermining the regrowth process. Calendars were marked, rituals timed, and families adjusted their lives around these invisible tides. The mixture itself was sometimes prepared under moonlight, stirred with wooden spoons carved from specific trees, which were believed to hold healing vibrations: mulberry, sandalwood, or ash. These seemingly small decisions were layered with belief and observation. Boiling bones also created more than just a liquid. The remaining sediment, often scraped from the pot bottom, was not discarded. This sticky residue was pressed into flat discs, dried in the sun, and stored as solid balms. When rubbed directly onto the scalp, they softened with the skin's warmth, seeping into pores like oil. These discs were especially favored by travelers and soldiers, who couldn't always carry fresh broth, but wanted to maintain the regimen. Wrapped in linen or tucked into leather pouches, these dried balms represented portable care, small tokens of hope against the toll of distance and hardship. These practices, however unusual they may sound today, were grounded in a desperate form of logic. When nothing else seemed to work, and when hair fell faster than it grew, people reached for what was near, what could be altered by hand and heat. They didn't see these mixtures as crude or primitive, but as refined through time and intention. The process of creating a cure was seen as a noble act, even if the results were slow or uncertain. People did not expect overnight miracles, but were prepared for long, deliberate efforts, a kind of slow healing born of endurance and repetition. Even failures were accepted with grace. If a mixture didn't produce the hoped-for growth, it wasn't thrown away. It was instead repurposed as a skin salve, a healing poultice, or burned again to become part of incense. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the process had potential. And within that mindset was a form of optimism, an understanding that nature rarely gives up on us, even when we're tempted to give up on ourselves. That optimism, wrapped in char and marrow, was the heart of the burnt almond and boiled bone tradition. It was never merely about cosmetics. It was about reclaiming a part of the self that had been worn away by hardship or age. In villages where these methods were still respected, it wasn't uncommon to find entire families devoted to their preparation. Children were trained to sort bones, teenagers assigned to monitor the boiling times, and elders charged with grinding the burnt almonds just so. The skill was inherited, refined, and protected like a treasured recipe. Some families even believed that success in other areas of life, fertility, harvest, love, was tied to how faithfully these rituals were kept. Their belief in these mixtures reflected something deeper, a yearning to maintain control over what little the world allowed them to influence. In homes with no mirrors, people relied on touch to sense progress. Fingers would glide over the scalp, searching for the faint resistance of new growth, feeling for a change in texture or temperature that might signal success. Sometimes neighbors were called to inspect one another's heads, giving honest reports with quiet encouragement. The absence of immediate change didn't always bring disappointment. It was the act itself, the routine, the consistency that gave people a sense of control in a world where so much remained unpredictable. To apply these ancient remedies was to believe in the body's ability to recover, even if it did so invisibly over time. Among traders and herbalists, burnt almond ash became a form of currency. It wasn't rare, but its preparation demanded effort, and that labor gave it worth. In busy markets, cloth sachets filled with charcoal dark powder were exchanged for dried figs, earthen salves, or even fragments of incense wood. These weren't luxury items, they were pieces of survival, small tools in the constant work of preserving dignity. Some vendors added subtle variations, mixing crushed cloves or powdered lotus root to create their own blend, enhancing the scent or altering its perceived potency. Each pouch bore a personal stamp, a symbol scratched into bark or bone that marked the maker's name. The practice also sparked curiosity beyond the regions that birthed it. Traveling scribes, exploring unknown lands, would document these unusual treatments in dusty journals, describing the smell of burnt almonds lingering in alleys or the sound of bone broth simmering at dawn. While outsiders didn't always understand the logic, they often recorded it with a sense of awe, noting the care with which these remedies were applied. Some tried to replicate the method, only to realize that the materials alone could not recreate the effect. It required patience, belief, and cultural memory. Without those, the paste was only powder, the broth just water. At times, communities would gather for seasonal hair restoration days, turning a solitary act into a shared experience. People sat together in circles, mixing ingredients, comparing notes, offering leftover supplies to those in need. It became more than treatment, it became tradition. Stories were told between applications, songs hummed while the bone mixture cooled, and laughter echoed beneath the shade of fig trees. These moments stitched families and neighbors together, reinforcing the belief that healing didn't happen alone. Even those who had little hair to save would participate, rubbing paste onto thinning crowns out of loyalty more than hope. In these gatherings, the past was preserved with each stir of the pot and each scoop of warm, thick liquid. Some households kept dedicated stones for grinding burnt almonds, never using them for food or other herbs. These stones were passed from grandmothers to grandchildren, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of friction. Holding one felt like touching history, and people often spoke to them as they worked, asking for wisdom or strength. The act of grinding wasn't rushed, it was meditative, done slowly to release the hidden oil trapped in the ash, creating a silky black powder that clung to fingertips. The fine dust would sometimes coat the air, settling on shelves, becoming a silent witness to the rituals performed daily or weekly without fail. Boiled bones, too, were handled with special reverence. The pots used for them were rarely shared with other meals, cleansed with herbs like basil or lemongrass before and after each session. The vessels themselves were important. Some swore by clay, others by iron. Clay retained warmth longer, while iron gave the mixture a different hue. The surface of the broth often shimmered slightly, a glistening layer of fat dancing on top. This film wasn't skimmed. It was scooped with care and saved in smaller jars for later use, believed to be the most potent layer. Women would massage this into their temples or behind their ears, thinking it might bring vitality to the finer, more delicate hairs in those regions. In times of drought or hardship, when almonds were scarce and bones harder to come by, people improvised. Peach pits were burnt instead of almonds. Fish bones replaced lamb or cow. The method adapted, but the intention stayed the same. They believed the universe rewarded effort, even when ingredients had to change. Children were taught never to mock these substitutions, as every version was seen as valid if it was made with sincerity. The rituals endured not because of what was used, but because of how they were respected. Every generation added something new while honoring the foundation of those who came before. Certain individuals became renowned for their skill in preparing these mixtures. These were not doctors in the modern sense, but guardians of a craft passed from mouth to ear. Their hands carried the scent of almond ash and marrow wherever they went. People would seek them out quietly, leaving behind coins, eggs, or bundles of herbs in gratitude. These practitioners rarely advertised. Their reputation spread by word alone. Their knowledge was guarded, and they were selective about sharing it. Some claimed they spoke to the paste while it formed, uttering rhythmic phrases to align the particles. Whether symbolic or sincere, it added a mystical layer to an already rich tradition. Even the disposal of used material was ritualized. Ashes left after application were not discarded casually. They were buried under specific trees, returned to the earth with a silent thank you. Bone scraps were not thrown in fire or garbage, but placed near rivers, carried away by flowing water as a gesture of release. These small gestures reflected a worldview where everything had spirit and nothing should be wasted without care. It was a cycle of giving and receiving, where even failed batches were treated as sacred, their remnants honored instead of ignored. In climates with heavy rain or long winters, families stored their almond ash and bone jelly in sealed containers lined with beeswax. Moisture was the enemy, capable of dulling the potency of even the strongest mixtures. Some even buried their jars underground, believing that resting them in soil amplified their power. During the warmer months, they would retrieve them and warm them by sunlight before use. Watching the paste soften in the glow of morning light became its own quiet ceremony, full of stillness and anticipation. Though modern science would likely scoff at such beliefs, reducing them to superstition or placebo, What can't be denied is the human longing behind it all, the need to hold on to something when everything else begins to slip. The mirror shows thinning, the comb gathers more strands, and the wind finds more scalp than before. In those moments, the simple act of preparing a remedy, however strange, becomes a form of self respect. It is not foolishness, it is hope, wrapped in charcoal and marrow, grounded in fire and flesh. Crushed bugs and brains in lip stains. In the colorful world of ancient and medieval cosmetics, beauty often came at a cost that modern sensibilities would find both fascinating and unsettling. Among the most vivid examples lies the curious use of crushed insects and animal-derived substances in lip stains, a practice that threads its way through centuries of experimentation, desire, and tradition. Red, as a symbol of allure, vitality, and power, has always captivated human imagination, and long before synthetic dyes existed, people turned to the natural world to extract its most potent pigments. Insects like cochineal and kermes became essential in the pursuit of the perfect red, their bodies ground into fine powders to provide the deep, rich hue coveted by noblewomen, performers, and royalty alike. These insects, particularly cochineal, which thrived on cactus plants in Central and South America, produced a crimson dye so vibrant that it remained highly prized well into the Renaissance and beyond. The practice of harvesting bugs for dye was both intricate and labor-intensive. Cochineal insects had to be carefully scraped from the prickly pads of their host plants, dried under the sun, and then meticulously crushed. The result was a brilliant carmine pigment that resisted fading and clung beautifully to fabrics and lips alike. As global trade expanded, this substance was transported across oceans, becoming an exotic and luxurious commodity in European courts. Even after the Spanish conquest disrupted the cultures that had cultivated the practice for centuries, the trade in crushed insect dyes continued, becoming a silent yet indispensable element of early cosmetic rituals. Women applied it to their lips, cheeks, and occasionally even their nipples, desiring that flush of red that suggested health, desirability, and aristocratic charm. But bugs were only one half of the strange ingredients list. In various parts of the world, powdered brains, usually from small animals, were also used in lip stain recipes, believed to create a creamy texture that helped the pigment adhere to the lips longer. The logic wasn't entirely without merit. Animal brains contain a rich mix of fats and proteins, which could function like an emulsifier or base, similar to what modern lipsticks achieve with waxes and oils. These mashed substances, sometimes blended with plant oils or beeswax, created pastes and balms that carried color while moisturizing the skin. To an outside observer, the idea of smearing the remains of brains and insects across one's mouth might seem grotesque, but for women of the time, it was simply another form of dedication to beauty, another ritual in a world where status, attraction, and social mobility often hinged on appearance. Historical recipes for lip stains often read like a mix between alchemy and culinary experimentation. Some included the addition of mulberries, crushed rose petals, or pomegranate seeds to temper the harsh scent of insects and animal tissue. Others would incorporate wine, vinegar, or even lead-based compounds to alter texture and longevity. Women would heat these mixtures in small pots, stirring them over open flames, testing the consistency with their fingers or on bits of cloth. These concoctions were then stored in ornate containers, silver pots, carved ivory boxes, or delicate glass vials, ready to be applied before a banquet, a court appearance, or an illicit meeting behind closed doors. The connection between bodily adornment and internal sacrifice is an ancient one. Even in cultures where makeup was frowned upon or discouraged publicly, the use of tinted balms often persisted in private. Lip stains made from such bizarre materials symbolized more than beauty. They were also instruments of identity and power. A woman who could afford imported cochineal or procure the brains of rare animals signaled her social reach. The richer the red, the louder the message it conveyed, not just of beauty, but of resources, connection, and audacity. Some women layered it thick, others wore it subtly, letting only a faint hint of carmine whisper across their mouth. In either case, it became a signature. Over time, the symbolism of red lips became layered with cultural meaning. In some societies, it was linked with fertility and youth, in others, with seduction. or sin. Yet none of that deterred the pursuit. In Victorian times, when modesty and restraint were preached publicly, some women still discreetly tinted their lips using boot polish or blended beetle powder with cold cream, hiding their mixtures inside drawers or disguised perfume jars. Even when lip painting was considered scandalous, the silent tradition of coloring one's lips continued underground, passed from mother to daughter, lady's maid to mistress. The methods evolved, but the intent remained consistent. Project allure, control perception, craft persona. As beauty rituals traveled across continents, the formulae for lip stains adapted to local resources. In parts of Asia, safflower petals were used alongside crushed beetles. In North Africa, henna-based balms were applied not only to lips but also to the gums to give the appearance of youthful vibrancy. Throughout it all, bugs and animal parts remained central, not as grotesque oddities, but as trusted ingredients. In the Middle East, crushed ants were sometimes added for a darker tint. In South America, annatto seeds might blend with cochineal for a double-strength red. The variations were endless, tailored to region, season, and status. Scientific analysis of some surviving cosmetic containers from archaeological digs has confirmed the presence of insect-derived compounds in lip preparations. These findings offer a tangible link to the people who once used them, real individuals who lived, breathed, and cared deeply about how they looked. Whether they were queens preparing for a coronation or performers awaiting a shadowy stage, their decision to stain their lips connected them to a wider, global tradition of self-decoration, using whatever materials the natural world would yield. These pigments, though perishable, carried with them a legacy of desire, invention, and resilience. By the time the industrial era began introducing synthetic dyes, the use of crushed bugs in lip stains had already endured for thousands of years. The emergence of coal tar dyes in the 19th century slowly pushed organic colorants aside, but never fully erased their legacy. Even today, some high-end cosmetic brands proudly use natural carmine, still derived from cochineal insects, for its superior hue and staying power. Labels may obscure the truth with vague terms like natural red 4, but the lineage remains. Those seeking organic or historical authenticity may even prefer these ancient components, seeing in them a bridge between modern vanity and ancestral wisdom. What's remarkable is not just the strange ingredient list, but the depth of commitment it took to maintain these practices. From collecting insects in thorny fields to extracting brain matter without contamination, the process was intense, deliberate, and sacred in its own way. The people who made these products were often women, artisans in their own right, passing down techniques, recipes, and secrets through generations. Their skill turned grotesque matter into glamour, creating lip stains that shimmered with the pulse of history. In retrospect, the phrase "beauty is pain" seems inadequate. Beauty was persistence, creativity, adaptation. To grind a beetle, boil a brain, or crush a petal into balm was to participate in a global conversation that spanned centuries. These lip stains, strange and visceral in origin, were small gestures with enormous weight. They decorated lips, yes, but they also spoke of trade routes, scientific curiosity, social ambition, and personal devotion. Each application was a ceremony, however minor, a quiet rebellion against plainness or obscurity. In the quiet glow of candlelight, before mirrors polished with mercury, countless women dipped their fingers or brushes into those rich reds, blotting their mouths with patience and care. They might have thought of love, of power, of rivalry. They might have thought of nothing at all, just of being seen, of being beautiful, or of simply being noticed. The crushed bugs and brains in their lip stains were not strange to them. They were tools. They were weapons. They were art. And through them, beauty found a way to endure. Raw, red, and unforgettable. Scraping skin for purity. Bleeding as a beauty treatment. In an era where external appearance was often believed to reflect internal virtue, the concept of beauty was not merely cosmetic. It was moral. The cleaner the skin, the purer the soul, or so many thought. This connection between aesthetics and ethics gave rise to some of the most painful and extreme beauty practices in human history, one of the most disturbing being the deliberate scraping and bleeding of the skin. Across various cultures and time periods, bleeding was not just a medical intervention. It was a ritualistic act tied to the ideals of cleansing, purification, and refinement. In pursuit of flawlessness, people were willing to endure pain, disfigurement, and even risk their lives, convinced that beauty must come through suffering. The practice of scraping the skin to the point of bleeding was often seen as a way to release impurities. Many believed that blemishes, discoloration, or uneven textures were signs of corruption, decay, or internal imbalance. Thus, beauty treatments were not gentle. They were aggressive assaults on the flesh meant to force the body into submission. Metal tools, sharp stones, or even shards of glass were sometimes used to peel away the top layers of the skin. The goal was to strip the body of its outer flaws, revealing a new, purified layer beneath. What we might today call exfoliation had, in these historical treatments, escalated into outright self-mutilation. Such rituals were often performed in dim chambers scented with herbs and incense, as if the environment itself needed to match the solemnity of the act. The scraping began with dampening the skin, usually with mixtures containing vinegar, wine, or even urine, believed to soften the epidermis. Then came the tool, crude, unsterilized, and terrifying. With deliberate strokes, layers of skin were peeled away and blood was drawn. For some, this bloodletting was not just collateral damage, it was the very essence of the ritual. Blood was symbolic. It carried disease, emotion, sin. Letting it flow was believed to drain the body of its poisons, leaving behind purity in both form and spirit. In elite circles, where vanity had the time and resources to evolve into obsession, such practices were even more elaborate. Some noble women underwent weekly bloodletting beauty sessions, assisted by personal servants or specialized attendants. The face, chest, and hands, visible parts of the body, were treated most intensely. After the bleeding, concoctions of honey, crushed pearls, or rose oil were applied to soothe the wounded skin, though these treatments rarely healed the damage fully. Scarring was common, though often hidden under layers of chalk-based makeup or masks. The irony of inflicting harm to appear more flawless was never questioned. Pain, after all, was the price of virtue. For commoners, the rituals were less refined but equally brutal. Without access to exotic balms or trained attendants, they relied on local herbs and makeshift instruments. In rural communities, sharp reeds or fish bones were used to scrape the skin. Some even bound their faces with rough cloths soaked in acidic juices, tightening them to the point of tearing. The resultant wounds were signs not of madness, but of dedication. In towns and villages, women who bore fresh scrapes on their faces were seen as pious and disciplined, having sacrificed their comfort for beauty's sacred glow. This obsession with bleeding as a beauty treatment was sometimes supported by early medical theories. Humoral medicine, dominant for centuries in Europe and the Middle East, posited that the body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose imbalance caused disease. Blood, being the most visible and abundant, was often blamed for ailments, including skin conditions. Bleeding through the skin, especially through scraping, was thought to restore harmony. Thus, the act straddled both the cosmetic and the curative, allowing women and men to claim they were healing themselves while also pursuing a clearer complexion. Religious overtones often reinforced the legitimacy of such treatments. In cultures where spiritual cleanliness paralleled physical appearance, to bleed for beauty was akin to penance. Some saw it as an earthly version of martyrdom, willingly enduring pain to elevate the soul. Scraped and bloodied faces became symbols of restraint, self-discipline, and sacred transformation. In certain convents, young women preparing for religious life were encouraged to purge the flesh, believing that the suffering would help them detach from vanity. Ironically, this very act of self-purification was also a performance of vanity in its purest, most fanatical form. The psychological effect of these treatments cannot be underestimated. Many who underwent repeated sessions became desensitized to the pain. Some even reported a kind of spiritual high, a euphoric release that accompanied the sting of metal on skin. The bleeding became addictive, not just for the hope of smoother skin, but for the sensation itself. Others fell into cycles of self-judgment, believing that any imperfection required immediate correction through scraping. This obsession with visible purity drove some to the brink of collapse, physically and emotionally worn down by their own relentless pursuit of perfection. Bleeding as a beauty treatment was also tied to ritual cycles. For some, it was part of a seasonal cleanse, springtime bleeding to refresh the body after winter's stagnation. For others, it marked significant life events like coming of age or preparing for marriage. Brides were often subjected to intense skin treatments in the weeks before their wedding. The idea was to ensure they entered their new life in a state of physical and moral radiance. If that meant going through days of swelling, oozing wounds, and searing pain, so be it. After all, the result was supposedly worth it. Despite the suffering involved, there was rarely protest against the practice. Communities upheld the idea that discipline was beautiful, and nothing demonstrated discipline more than the ability to smile through pain. In some households, young girls were trained early, taught by mothers and grandmothers to scrape gently at first, then deeper as they aged. By adolescence, many were already proficient in the practice, having internalized the belief that their natural skin was something to be fixed. Compliments often came with qualifiers. She has such a clear face. She must bleed regularly. As the centuries passed and more scientific understanding of skin health developed, these practices gradually fell out of favor, but echoes of them remained. Even today, remnants can be seen in microdermabrasion treatments, chemical peels, and procedures that promise to renew the skin through controlled damage. The language may have changed. Modern terms like revitalizing, rejuvenating, or detoxifying soften the brutality, but the premise is eerily familiar. Peel back, strip away, let the old die so that beauty can be born anew. The legacy of bleeding as a cosmetic act speaks volumes about how societies have long linked pain with purity. While we may cringe at the idea of scraping skin until it weeps, it's worth considering how deeply the roots of this belief still run. Beauty in many cultures is not passive, it is conquered, earned, endured. That ideology continues to echo in everything from invasive beauty surgeries to the silent suffering of people who push their bodies beyond comfort in the name of attraction. In examining these practices from a distance, one sees not only the cruelty, but the desperation. In a world that often punished women for aging, judged them for blemishes, and tied their worth to appearance, the idea of bleeding for beauty wasn't madness. It was survival. They bled, not because they didn't value themselves, but because society taught them that value was measured in smoothness, in glow, in flawlessness, purchased through pain. These rituals were not born out of vanity alone, but from the pressure to conform to ideals that were as punishing as they were impossible. And so, with trembling hands and scraped skin, countless individuals throughout history chased a beauty that was not just skin deep, but soul deep, defined not by joy or health, but by the blood they were willing to lose. Lead painted faces, the deadly glow of medieval beauty. In the dim, candlelit chambers of medieval nobility, beauty was not just a pursuit. It was an expectation, a performance, a silent competition where skin tone, grace, and allure could define status and social power. For many women and some men, the ideal complexion was one of ghostly whiteness, a pale canvas untouched by the sun, symbolizing wealth, purity, and a life free from labor. But achieving this ideal came at a cost, one brushed on layer by layer with deadly precision. Among the many practices adopted in the name of beauty, none was more treacherous than the application of lead-based makeup. White lead, known for its bright, smooth finish, was ground into fine powder and mixed with vinegar or rosewater to create a creamy substance that could be applied to the face. This mixture, often referred to as Venetian ceruse or simply face paint, became a staple in beauty arsenals across Europe. Nobles prized it not only for its ability to conceal blemishes and scars from diseases like smallpox, but also for its striking porcelain-like finish. The face, transformed under its touch, seemed to glow with a supernatural elegance, a beauty that, ironically, masked the slow destruction it was causing beneath the surface. The moment the paint touched skin, it began a silent invasion. Lead is a heavy metal with toxic properties, and prolonged exposure, especially through the delicate pores of the face, led to a cascade of health problems. Skin would dry and crack beneath the thick paste, requiring even more layers to maintain the illusion. Users developed lesions, discoloration, and an almost constant burning sensation. Yet these signs were mistaken as signs of aging or illness, not recognized as the direct result of the very substance used to prevent them. The more damage the lead caused, the more it seemed necessary to apply. Over time, lead began to accumulate in the body. It affected the nervous system, dulling cognition, impairing memory, and triggering mood swings. It weakened muscles and joints, making basic movements painful. In advanced stages, lead poisoning caused fatigue, anemia, and in many cases, death. Yet the awareness of this link was nearly non-existent. Even if suspicions arose, the allure of beauty held firm. In an era when reputation and appearance were everything, the idea of abandoning a cosmetic that delivered such dramatic visual transformation seemed almost unthinkable. Some of the most admired women of the period were known for their unnaturally pale skin. Royal courts whispered praises of those who appeared to glow in torchlight, faces painted into living dolls. But behind closed doors, many of them suffered quietly. Teeth loosened and fell out, hair thinned, eyebrows disappeared, appetite waned. A regal face in public was often followed by hours of agony in private. The process of applying and removing the paint was also brutal. Abrasive materials like wool or pumice were used to scrape the layers off, tearing the skin and leaving it vulnerable to infection. Despite these effects, lead-based beauty products remained in circulation for centuries. Recipes were passed down, sometimes even improved upon, as if refining poison could make it safe. Women shared techniques in hushed tones, speaking of remedies to soften the burn or herbs to cool the inflamed skin. But none of these fixes addressed the core danger. Still, vanity won the argument. Being beautiful was seen as essential to a good marriage, to respect, to survival within the ranks of aristocracy. In that sense, the painted face was more than a mask. It was a form of armor in a world that valued women largely by their appearance. Even when medical texts began to quietly question the wisdom of using such ingredients, their warnings were largely ignored. Physicians of the time were still grappling with basic understandings of disease and toxicity. Bloodletting was still common, and the concept of chemical poisoning was poorly understood. The idea that something as innocuous as a face cream could destroy the body seemed absurd. As a result, beauty rituals continued unchanged, passed along from one generation to the next, like family heirlooms. The obsession with pale skin was not isolated to just one region. It spread across medieval Europe, each culture adapting the practice with slight variations. In England, women favored thick, opaque layers of white paint that shimmered in candlelight. In Italy, a more refined finish was prized, often topped with a touch of rouge to give the illusion of youth. But the core ingredients were the same, and so were the consequences. It wasn't unusual for noble women to become increasingly sick as they aged, their declining health masked by rumors of heartbreak or weak constitution. The real cause, long-term exposure to lead, remained hidden beneath layers of tradition and powder. The deeper tragedy was that these beauty standards were enforced not just by society, but by a culture of silence. Women who dared to appear in public without makeup were often ridiculed, seen as lazy, unkempt, or lower class. A bare face was considered a sign of disrespect, especially in courtly settings. And so many women learned to suffer in silence, painting on their smiles just as they painted on their skin. The mirror became both a friend and an enemy, a tool of self-creation and self-destruction in equal measure. Men were not entirely immune to the trend. Some courtiers and performers also used lead-based cosmetics, especially in theatrical or ceremonial settings. But it was women who bore the brunt of the daily exposure, expected to maintain their appearance even through illness and childbirth. The expectations were relentless, and the cost was high. Mothers sometimes taught their daughters how to prepare and apply the deadly mixture, unknowingly passing down a legacy of pain disguised as elegance. As time wore on and the Enlightenment approached, scientific inquiry began to unravel some of the mysteries behind persistent illnesses. Slowly, the pieces began to come together. Cases of painter's colic, a common affliction among artists who handled lead pigments, started to resemble the symptoms seen in noble households. Scholars noticed correlations. Still, the cosmetic industry of the time resisted change. There were profits to be made and demand remained high. It wasn't until centuries later, with the rise of modern toxicology and regulations, that white lead was definitively recognized as a health hazard and removed from cosmetic formulations. Looking back, the painted faces of the medieval elite tell a cautionary tale. They reflect a world where beauty was both power and prison, where appearance meant everything, even at the expense of life itself. The glowing white skin so prized in portraits and poetry was, in reality, a warning sign, a bright facade over a dark truth. What appeared as grace was often the slow fading of vitality. The delicate touch of a brush was the beginning of a long, painful decline. Today, when we marvel at portraits of medieval nobility, their expressions serene and their skin luminous, we are also seeing the legacy of a toxic ideal. It reminds us that the pursuit of beauty, unchecked by knowledge or care, can become a quiet kind of violence. The story of lead-painted faces is not just about vanity. It's about the price people are willing to pay for acceptance, for admiration, for a place in a world that often judged the surface more than the soul beneath. As science continues to evolve and redefine our standards, we are offered the chance to question not just the products we use, but the ideals we inherit. The faces of the past, painted in ghostly hues, whisper through time a message as haunting as it is clear. Beauty without awareness can kill softly and slowly with a smile. The plague mask as a fashion statement. In the depths of Europe's darkest pandemics, when death swept through villages and cities with relentless persistence, one image became both a symbol of dread and a curious element of style: the plague doctor's mask. Initially designed for protection during outbreaks of bubonic plague, this distinctive mask with its long, bird-like beak took on a life far beyond its grim purpose. Over time, it would evolve from a medical tool into a subject of fascination, parody, and eventually a peculiar fashion statement embedded in the cultural psyche. The original purpose of the plague mask was rooted in the medical theories of the 17th century. At the time, it was widely believed that disease spread through miasma, poisoned air filled with harmful vapors. To counter this, the mask's beak was filled with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, or spices thought to purify the air before it reached the lungs. The doctors who wore them were already an unsettling sight, their long dark robes and glassy eye sockets giving them an almost supernatural presence. But this eerie appearance inadvertently created an aesthetic that left an imprint far beyond its medical application. In a world where death loomed over every household, people turned to symbolism and superstition to cope. The mask became more than just a medical device. It grew into an icon. Paintings, woodcuts, and sketches of the era often featured plague doctors as haunting figures looming in the background. Yet, this visual familiarity bred an odd kind of cultural acceptance. Over time, the image of the beaked mask, initially associated with fear and disease, became a motif in festivals, literature, and even early masquerade balls. The mask's ability to obscure identity and create a sense of mystery made it a perfect fit for the elaborate and theatrical costumes of Venetian carnivals. As the centuries passed and the horrors of the plague faded into history, the mask did not disappear. Instead, it was reimagined. In the opulent chaos of the 18th century masquerade scene, where nobles and commoners alike donned extravagant costumes to dance and drink beneath candlelit chandeliers, the plague mask resurfaced in curious ways. Now made of fine leather or polished ceramic, its exaggerated beak and dramatic silhouette no longer served a medical purpose, but rather a dramatic one. It became a statement, worn not to ward off illness, but to attract attention. Wearing the plague mask was not simply about hiding one's identity, it was about standing out. Its unusual shape and sinister aura lent the wearer an air of theatrical danger, a play on the historical associations of the mask itself. This paradoxical mix of allure and menace drew people in. Artists began to depict plague mask characters in their works not as figures of pity or fear, but as enigmatic players in the grand performance of life. Theater companies use the mask as a visual shorthand for mystery and transformation, further embedding it in the realm of cultural spectacle. In modern times, the plague mask has undergone yet another metamorphosis. No longer confined to dusty books or the pages of costume catalogs, it has become a fixture in alternative fashion scenes, gothic aesthetics, and avant-garde runway shows. Designers have taken the classic silhouette and reinterpreted it with metal, lace, and even LED lights. It has been seen on fashion runways, music videos, and in high-end photo shoots, where the line between fashion and performance art is deliberately blurred. The plague mask, once a symbol of desperation, has become an accessory of choice for those seeking to make bold, defiant statements about beauty, mortality, and identity. Its resurgence in popular culture has not been accidental. Periods of global uncertainty, such as modern pandemics, have often triggered a renewed interest in historical symbols of disease and survival. In a world that once again found itself hiding behind masks, the plague doctor's visage returned with new relevance. It became a canvas for commentary, a way for artists, designers, and creators to explore the tension between protection and exposure, life and death, fear and defiance. The dark elegance of the mask lends itself to reinterpretation. It has become a staple in steampunk subculture, often adorned with brass fittings, gears, and antiquated lenses, reflecting a retrofuturistic vision of a world suspended in both past and future. Similarly, in goth fashion, the plague mask embodies themes of decay, power, and mystique. It offers a visual language for those who navigate the shadows of conventional style, who embrace symbols of mortality not with dread, but with curiosity and expression. What makes the plague mask so enduring is its capacity to straddle the boundary between horror and beauty. It speaks to the human fascination with death and the desire to aestheticize even our darkest moments. By donning the mask, one doesn't merely wear a costume. They engage with centuries of memory, emotion, and meaning. It's a transformation, a nod to history, and a rebellion against forgetting. The wearer becomes both a relic and a statement, a moving piece of cultural memory cloaked in performance. The theatrical nature of the plague mask also lends itself to protest and political expression. Some modern performance artists and demonstrators have incorporated it into acts meant to critique healthcare systems, governmental responses to disease, or societal indifference to suffering. Its historical weight gives it power. When someone appears in a crowd clad in black with a long-beaked mask, they are not just making a visual impact, they are invoking ghosts of the past to haunt the present. Despite its morbid origins, the plague mask has become one of the few fashion symbols that continuously evolves without losing its essence. It carries with it the whisper of ancient corridors, of cities blanketed in silence, and of a time when to wear it was an act of courage. Yet it also thrives in the brightness of modern spotlights, transformed into high art and bold fashion. It challenges the norms of beauty and dares the world to look discomfort in the eye. From leather artisans to digital illustrators, creators today continue to reimagine the plague mask in unexpected ways. Some incorporate elements from natural history, turning the beak into a vessel for feathers, beetle shells, or crystals. Others lean into science fiction, merging the mask with gas mask technology or cyberpunk aesthetics. The results are consistently arresting, each version of the mask telling a slightly different story, one that is rooted in history, yet reaching toward a speculative future. For some, the mask remains a symbol of fear and suffering, but for others, it is a reminder of resilience and the human capacity to adapt even the tools of despair into expressions of selfhood. In galleries, stage performances, and underground fashion shows, the plague mask now exists as both costume and commentary, a bridge between function and fantasy. It has become a space where history, art, and personal expression collide in dramatic fashion. Perhaps most fascinating is how the mask blurs the line between the individual and the collective. In its earliest days, it was worn to protect the healer while simultaneously marking them as different, as someone who carried knowledge and risk in equal measure. Today, it still signals a kind of duality, the individual within a crowd, the performer amid the spectators, the memory within the present. It demands attention and contemplation, challenging those who see it to reckon with its origins and its transformations. The fashion world's embrace of the plague mask speaks to a broader truth, that style is not always about lightness, comfort, or clarity. Sometimes it is about disruption, provocation, and the power to make people stop and think. The plague mask, with its elongated beak and ghostly features, does not conform to typical notions of attractiveness. Yet its very strangeness makes it compelling. It invites a second glance, a moment of reflection, a pause in an otherwise bustling world. As designers, performers, and thinkers continue to explore the possibilities of this haunting object, it's clear that the plague mask is far from a relic of the past. It lives on in art, on runways, and in the margins of cultural expression where fashion meets memory. Its journey from the wards of plague-ridden Europe to the stages of modern performance and the catwalks of high fashion is a testament to the strange ways in which symbols evolve and endure. In this unlikely transformation, the mask reminds us that even in our darkest hours, humanity finds ways to reshape fear into something strangely beautiful. Urine as a skin brightener, a royal routine. In the lavish courts of ancient dynasties and early European nobility, beauty standards often shaped the daily routines of those who aspired to reflect not just elegance, but dominance and distinction. Skin tone, in particular, became a potent symbol of class, health, and desirability. The fairer and more luminous the complexion, the more elevated the individual was assumed to be in status. In pursuit of this glow, some royals and aristocrats turned to a practice that would seem shocking by today's standards, applying urine to the skin as a brightening agent. This was not done out of desperation or superstition alone, but rather informed by a peculiar blend of early science, observation, and tradition. Urine, especially when fresh or allowed to ferment slightly, was believed to possess purifying qualities. Across several regions and time periods, it was thought that the liquid contained natural elements capable of cleansing impurities from the body, both internally and externally. While many cultures used it in medicinal practices, its application in skincare stood out, particularly among individuals who could afford to explore a wide array of treatments. Royal households employed attendants whose tasks included collecting morning urine, which was often deemed the most potent due to its clarity and supposed purity. This liquid was gently dabbed onto the face or even used in full facial rinses, usually before bed or during morning rituals. Physicians of the time, with limited understanding of biochemistry, observed that skin treated with aged urine sometimes appeared clearer or more evenly toned. The reason for this effect can partly be attributed to the presence of urea, a compound that, in small concentrations, can exfoliate the skin by helping to break down hardened proteins and encourage the shedding of dead skin cells. This subtle renewal gave users the impression that their complexions had been refreshed. Without microscopes or a firm grasp of dermatology, these surface improvements were enough to earn urine a place in the cosmetic repertoire of the elite. Far from being a mere folk remedy, the use of urine for cosmetic purposes was recorded in manuscripts and beauty treatises kept in royal archives and passed down through generations. These documents sometimes recommended mixing urine with other ingredients such as rosewater, crushed pearls, or powdered herbs to reduce its odor and enhance its effects. In court settings where appearances were a currency, maintaining bright, unblemished skin could mean the difference between social elevation and obscurity. Women and men alike participated in these routines, though often in private, away from public scrutiny. The preference for pale, flawless skin had many roots. In Europe, it denoted a life free from outdoor labor, implying wealth and refinement. In parts of Asia, similar associations existed, linking fair skin to intellectual pursuits and high social rank. While modern perspectives view beauty as more inclusive and personal, the historical obsession with light, unblemished skin created a demand for any remedy that promised results, regardless of its origins. Urine, inexpensive and readily available, offered a solution that, when combined with other luxury ingredients, seemed both practical and effective. The fermentation process of urine was sometimes seen as enhancing its potency. This process, referred to as aged urine, allowed ammonia levels to rise, which in turn acted as a mild antiseptic. In the absence of modern preservatives and synthetic chemicals, this natural disinfecting property likely helped reduce certain types of skin blemishes. Though the smell may have been off-putting, court attendants were often instructed to mask it with fragrant oils or to apply it in well-ventilated chambers. Some royal bathhouses even included this treatment in their menu of services, especially for those dealing with persistent acne or uneven pigmentation. The social context of the time cannot be ignored when analyzing the adoption of such practices. Aesthetic rituals, especially those practiced by royalty, were seldom questioned. If a queen or high-ranking noblewoman attributed her radiant skin to a daily rinse with urine, others would follow suit, eager to replicate her glow. These routines became part of whispered beauty secrets, shared among courtiers and passed along like valuable recipes. They were considered sophisticated knowledge, cloaked in a veil of exclusivity that added to their allure. Beyond facial applications, urine was occasionally used on the body to address rough patches, calluses, or discoloration. The idea was to soften and lighten these areas, helping the skin appear more uniform. In colder climates, where skin was prone to drying and cracking, this unusual treatment served as a kind of primitive chemical peel. Combined with massaging techniques and followed by oiling with almond or olive oil, it became a full-body regimen for those with the means and daring to adopt it. It wasn't uncommon for these rituals to be spiritualized. In certain traditions, bodily fluids were not simply waste but extensions of one's vital essence. Using them for self-care was framed not as repulsive but as a form of bodily recycling, a return of strength and purity to oneself. In royal households, where alchemy and mysticism were still interwoven with medicine and science, urine was thought to carry transformative energy, capable of not just cleaning, but renewing. Such beliefs allowed the practice to gain legitimacy even among educated elites. Despite modern revulsion, it's important to view these practices through the lens of historical necessity and cultural norms. Without access to laboratories, controlled testing, or a true understanding of infection and hygiene, people experimented with what they had. Royal routines were often extreme, filled with experimentation in pursuit of everlasting youth or divine perfection. Using urine was just one among many surprising methods, alongside mercury masks, bloodletting facials, and crushed insect powders. Interestingly, some remnants of this ancient practice have lingered into more recent times. During the early 20th century, there were still isolated reports of individuals using urine to treat skin conditions such as eczema or psoriasis. Even modern dermatology has acknowledged the exfoliating and hydrating benefits of urea-based creams, though, of course, these products are synthesized and hygienically prepared, free of the odorous baggage their predecessors carried. In folklore, tales persisted about legendary figures whose beauty stemmed from unorthodox rituals. Whether fictionalized or grounded in truth, these stories often included references to secretive nighttime regimens or sacred mixtures guarded by personal attendants. In this way, urine-based skincare treatments achieved a kind of mythical status, hidden in shadows yet surviving in whispers through the ages. Royalty, ever eager to defy the limits of mortality and imperfection, embraced unusual remedies with a seriousness that bordered on obsession. Beauty was not a passive attribute, but a carefully cultivated persona. Every inch of skin was treated as a canvas to reflect power, allure, and control. Within this context, even the most unconventional methods were welcomed, so long as they produced results. Urine, humble and overlooked in other spheres, found itself elevated, at least for a time, to the realm of luxury and transformation. Those who question how such a practice gained acceptance must consider how deeply fear of aging and imperfection drove the elite to extraordinary lengths. In societies where portraits, court gatherings, and political marriages all hinged upon one's appearance, no opportunity for enhancement was too strange. The skin was scrutinized under candlelight and sunlight alike, and even minor blemishes were seen as weaknesses to be corrected. In this high-pressure environment, urine's perceived ability to even out tone and smooth imperfections was viewed as a rare and potent gift. What made this practice particularly unique was its blend of accessibility and secrecy. Unlike imported oils or exotic herbs, urine was free and personal. Yet its use was often kept discreet, never discussed openly among the public or commoners. This silence contributed to its mystique. Only the most trusted attendants were allowed to assist in such rituals, and instructions were often passed down orally rather than recorded, ensuring that the knowledge remained within inner circles. As generations passed and scientific understanding expanded, such treatments gradually faded. New developments in skincare provided alternatives that were more palatable, more perfumed, and supported by clearer evidence. Still, the history remains, a curious chapter in the ever-evolving story of beauty. It reveals not only what people were willing to do in the name of appearance, but also how definitions of cleanliness, health, and prestige were shaped by context and necessity. Urine, far from being merely waste, once occupied a peculiar space between the sacred and the scientific. For those in royal circles, it was a tool, odd, intimate, and powerful. While modern sensibilities may recoil, History does not erase what once was embraced with confidence and hope. In palaces draped with silk and halls echoing with music, this liquid was not discarded. It was treasured, transformed into a means of refinement, a private secret of the polished and privileged. Rotten breath remedies from the Middle Ages. In the winding alleys and smoky halls of medieval Europe, bad breath wasn't merely a social inconvenience. It was often believed to be a sign of illness, moral decay, or even spiritual corruption. Without the benefit of modern dental hygiene, people of the Middle Ages had to rely on whatever knowledge, herbs, and rituals were available to them to combat what we now call halitosis. Though primitive by today's standards, many of these remedies were deeply rooted in the logic of their time and reflected the blend of superstition, herbal knowledge, and rudimentary medical understanding that shaped daily life. People turned to nature, religion, and routine habits to try to keep their breath as fresh as possible, especially in courtly or urban settings where close proximity made such things harder to ignore. One of the most commonly used methods involved the chewing of aromatic herbs. Parsley, mint, and fennel were popular for their ability to mask odors. People believed these herbs didn't just freshen the mouth, but also purified the stomach, which was thought to be the origin of foul-smelling breath. Chewing on cloves was another favorite, especially among the wealthier classes who could afford imported spices. These pungent buds were carried in small pouches or tucked into the corners of the mouth throughout the day, subtly releasing their scent. Some even stitched little sachets of herbs into the fabric of their clothing so that pleasant aromas would linger around them, providing a kind of olfactory camouflage. A more involved remedy included the boiling of herbs in wine or vinegar to create mouthwashes. Rose water was often added for fragrance and status, since it was both expensive and highly regarded for its supposed cleansing properties. Mouthwashes were swirled vigorously before being spat out, though in some cases they were swallowed to treat internal causes of bad breath, according to the medical theories of the time. Physicians often recommended mixtures of sage, rosemary, and thyme, steeped in vinegar, which were thought to draw out foul humors from the mouth and throat. Gargling with salt water was also practiced, not only for breath, but to soothe the throat and prevent illness, as salt was considered both purifying and protective. Tooth cleaning, though rudimentary, was not entirely unknown. People sometimes used frayed twigs or cloths dipped in vinegar or wine to scrub their teeth. The aim was to remove food residue and stimulate the gums, which were thought to influence breath. Baking soda wasn't yet part of the equation, but ash from burned herbs or charcoal was sometimes used to rub the teeth, not so much for whitening, but to control the odor. Some physicians also advised rinsing the mouth with warm milk infused with herbs, believing it could draw out impurities from deep within the gums. Dietary choices were also believed to affect breath, and certain foods were avoided or embraced accordingly. Onions and garlic, although staples, were known to leave a lasting odor. Those who could afford to do so might limit their intake before public events or social engagements. Instead, they consumed apples, pears, or soft cheeses to cool the breath. Apples in particular were believed to have cleansing properties and were often eaten after meals as a natural refresher. Spiced wine, known as hypocras, was another favorite option, not just as a digestive aid, but for leaving a pleasantly scented trace in one's breath. Monasteries and religious institutions, while not usually the centers of fashion or courtly life, played a surprising role in preserving and developing breath remedies. Monks meticulously recorded herbal recipes in manuscripts, including those for breath-freshening tonics and pastes. These included complex combinations of roots, flowers, and seeds, often prepared in small apothecaries attached to the monastery itself. They might grind herbs into powders, mix them with honey, and roll them into small pills to be sucked slowly, an early version of the breath mint. These concoctions were often offered not just for foul breath, but for other ailments of the mouth, like ulcers or sore throats. Religious beliefs also contributed to breath-related practices. In some regions, bad breath was linked to sin or spiritual imbalance. A priest might recommend fasting or confessing one's sins to cleanse both the body and the soul, thereby improving breath in the process. Holy water, believed to purify anything it touched, was sometimes used in rinses, although this was more symbolic than effective. Pilgrims returning from sacred sites often brought back small vials of scented oils or sacred herbs, believed to have healing powers, and these were sometimes used to anoint the mouth or lips as a protective measure against both odor and illness. Animal products were also part of the medieval arsenal. Powdered deer antler, when mixed with honey and taken in regularly, was believed to strengthen the teeth and sweeten the breath. Likewise, some medical texts advised boiling certain animal bones to extract their gelatin, which could be mixed with herbs and ingested. While there's little scientific merit to these ideas, they were taken seriously at the time and included in many physicians' handbooks. Even more curiously, dried beaver gland or musk from civet cats was sometimes worn around the neck or dabbed on the skin to counteract bad odors of the body, including breath, although these were far beyond the reach of ordinary folk. The wealthy often had access to more elaborate remedies. They employed personal apothecaries who would create custom mixtures based on the person's temperament, diet, and habits. These mixtures could include exotic ingredients such as cinnamon from Ceylon, cardamom from India, or even ambergris, an aromatic substance from Wales that was considered the height of luxury. These were not only used to freshen the breath, but to signal wealth and refinement. The breath of a noblewoman was expected to be fragrant, and her personal attendants might present her with delicate confections known as comfits, sugar-coated seeds or nuts infused with floral or spice flavors, consumed after meals to cleanse the mouth. Among the poorer classes, simpler remedies prevailed. Field herbs like sorrel and wild thyme were chewed during the day, not only for their taste, but their scent. Bread crusts were sometimes rubbed on the teeth as a crude brush, and ashes from the hearth were repurposed as a cleaning agent. Farmers and peasants didn't have the luxury of exotic spices or imported herbs, but they found clever uses for what they had. Chewing tree bark, especially from birch or willow, was one such habit, based on the belief that it drew toxins from the body and could remove the staleness of breath. Folk remedies passed down orally from generation to generation often included rituals or charms. One might be told to say a prayer while rinsing the mouth or to wash at a specific time of day, such as dawn or dusk, when the air was thought to be most pure. Certain flowers, like marigold or lavender, were kept near the bed or worn in pouches around the neck to ward off bad odors. In some traditions, placing a silver coin under the tongue was thought to absorb foul breath, though this was more symbolic than practical. Stories of cursed breath or breath that could cause illness in others weren't uncommon, and these tales served to reinforce the importance of breath in both health and social standing. While none of these methods compare to the effectiveness of modern dental care, they reveal a world where people were intensely aware of their physical presence and the sensory signals they sent to others. Breath was not just a matter of scent, but a reflection of one's internal state, one's morals, and even one's standing in society. Remedies were born of necessity, shaped by observation, and colored by the mystical thinking of the time. Whether through ritual, herb, or habit, medieval people sought ways to control what they couldn't fully understand, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for the hygiene practices we often take for granted today. The effort to cleanse the breath, humble as it may seem, was part of a broader quest to bring order, dignity, and meaning to the challenges of daily life in a world where the body and soul were believed to be closely intertwined.